They said no man would bid on the fat widow's basket. They were wrong. In Red Willow, Montana, Christmas 1889, Ruby Lawson stood before a jeering crowd as the auctioneer lifted her basket. The last one, always the last one. Silence fell like a guillotine. Then a voice from the shadows called out $30, triple what any basket had fetched that night. The town gasped. Ruby's heart stopped, because the man walking toward her wasn't just any rancher. He was the stranger she'd saved on a frozen road, and he was about to shatter every cruel assumption this town had ever made about her worth. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruby's story travels. The first snow of December fell on Red Willow like a benediction, soft and forgiving, covering the rutted streets and weathered storefronts in a blanket of white that made everything look clean. Ruby Lawson stood at her kitchen window, watching the flakes drift past the frosted glass, and felt the familiar ache settle in her chest, the one that came every year when the Christmas season arrived, bringing with it memories of warmth she no longer possessed. She was 32 years old, though the mirror sometimes whispered she looked older. The past 3 years since Thomas died had carved lines around her eyes that laughter used to occupy. Her body, always generous in its proportions, had become something the town discussed in whispers that weren't quite whispers, soft enough to maintain plausible deniability, loud enough to ensure she heard every word. The fat widow. That's what they called her when they thought she couldn't hear. Sometimes when they knew she could. Ruby turned from the window and surveyed her small cabin, neat as a pin, warm from the cook stove, smelling of cinnamon and yeast. Thomas had built this house with his own hands, every board chosen with care, every nail driven with the promise of forever. He'd died in the third winter, pneumonia taking him so fast she'd barely had time to say goodbye, and she'd rattled around in these rooms ever since like a dried pea in a too large pod. The town had been kind at first, the way small towns are when tragedy strikes one of their own. Casseroles appeared on her doorstep. Reverend Michaels stopped by to pray. The ladies' auxiliary had taken up a collection. But kindness has a shelf life, especially for a woman alone, especially for a woman whose body didn't conform to the narrow specifications of acceptable widowhood. By the second year, the casseroles had stopped. By the third, the whispers had started. She should remarry. Who would want her looking like that? It's unseemly, a woman alone. She's let herself go. Ruby had learned to hold her head high, to smile when she walked down Main Street, to pretend she didn't notice how conversation stopped when she entered the general store. She'd learned to be small in all the ways that mattered, even as her body refused to cooperate with the town's expectations. But Christmas was the worst. Every year the town held a Christmas auction, a tradition imported from back east and embraced with the fervor of people desperate for civilization in the wilderness. The unmarried women prepared elaborate baskets filled with their finest cooking, decorated with ribbons and bows, and the men bid on them. The winning bidder got to share the meal with the woman who'd prepared it, a sanctioned courtship ritual dressed up in holiday cheer and charitable giving. Ruby had participated twice since Thomas died. The first year, Reverend Michaels had bid on her basket out of pity, sharing her fried chicken in painful silence while shooting anxious glances at his wife across the room. The second year, no one had bid at all. The auctioneer had let the silence stretch until Ruby thought she might die of shame, then quietly moved on to the next basket, leaving hers unclaimed on the table like a rejected child. She hadn't planned to participate this year. She'd told herself she was done with that particular humiliation. But then came that day in early November, the day that changed everything, though she didn't know it at the time. Ruby had been driving her small wagon back from the Morrison Ranch, where she'd delivered 3 loaves of bread and a dried apple pie. Mrs. Morrison was one of the few women in Red Willow who still treated Ruby with consistent kindness, and she paid good money for Ruby's baking, money Ruby desperately needed to keep the cabin warm and food on the table. The November sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the threat of snow. Ruby urged her old mare, Molly, to pick up the pace. She was still 5 miles from town when she saw him. A man stood beside a broken wagon wheel, his horse cropping grass nearby with the unconcerned air of an animal that knew this delay meant rest. The man himself was bent over the wheel, his broad shoulders straining against a canvas coat, his hat pulled low against the wind that had started to rise. Ruby's first instinct was to keep driving. A woman alone didn't stop for strange men. Not in Montana territory, not ever. But something about the set of his shoulders, the methodical way he worked at the wheel despite its obvious hopelessness, made her pull Molly to a halt. "You need help?" she called out, keeping a safe distance. The man looked up, and Ruby caught her first glimpse of his face, angular and weathered, with eyes the color of winter sky and a day's worth of stubble darkening his jaw. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the lean, rangy build of someone who worked with his hands. "Wheels split clean through," he said, his voice carrying a trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. "Won't make it another mile." "Town's 5 miles east," Ruby said. "Blacksmith there could fix it." "I know." He straightened, wincing slightly as if his back pained him. "I was headed there. Reckon I'll have to leave the wagon and ride in, come back tomorrow with a new wheel." Ruby considered him for a long moment. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping fast. If snow started falling, as it looked likely to do, the road could become impassable within hours. "You can tie your horse to the back of my wagon," she heard herself say. "Load what you need from yours. I'll take you into town." The man's eyes widened slightly. "That's kind of you, ma'am, but I couldn't—" "You could freeze out here if the storm comes in as fast as it looks like it will," Ruby interrupted. "And your horse won't do you much good if you're dead. I'm offering a ride to town, nothing more. You can take it or leave it." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "I'll take it then, and I'm grateful." His name was Declan Hart. She learned on the ride into town. He'd bought the old Whitmore ranch on the north edge of the valley, been there about 6 months, working the place alone. He didn't say much beyond that, and Ruby didn't press. She'd learned that silence could be a kindness, that not everyone wanted to explain themselves to strangers. But when they reached Red Willow and she pulled up in front of the blacksmith shop, Declan climbed down from the wagon and looked at her with those winter sky eyes and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Lawson," Ruby said. "Ruby Lawson." "Mrs. Lawson." He tipped his hat. "I won't forget this kindness." Ruby had driven away thinking that would be the end of it. A brief encounter with a stranger, nothing more. She'd been wrong. Now standing in her kitchen as December snow fell outside, Ruby pulled a crate from beneath her bed and lifted out the basket she'd been working on for the past 3 weeks. She'd told herself she wasn't going to do this. She'd promised herself she wouldn't subject herself to another year of humiliation. But somewhere between November and now, something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that she was so damn tired of being invisible, of letting the town's judgment dictate her actions. Or maybe, and she barely let herself think this, maybe it was because of the man she'd helped on the road, and the way he'd looked at her like she was a person, not a problem. The basket itself was beautiful. Even she had to admit that. She'd woven it from willow branches she'd gathered and dried herself, had lined it with a red and white checked cloth she'd sewn by hand. Inside, she'd packed the best of everything. Fried chicken with a crust so crispy it shattered at first bite, biscuits light as clouds, potato salad creamy with fresh butter and sharp with vinegar, gingerbread cookies dark with molasses and warming with spice, and a dried cherry pie that had taken her 2 days to prepare. Each cherry pitted by hand, each lattice strip of crust woven with care. It was, without false modesty, the best cooking she'd ever done. It would also, almost certainly, be rejected again. Ruby tied a bow around the basket handle, red ribbon she'd saved from last Christmas, and set it by the door. The auction was tonight, and she was going, and if no one bid, well, at least she'd know she'd tried one more time. At least she could say she hadn't let them make her disappear. The Red Willow Community Hall blazed with light against the December darkness, windows glowing warm and golden, the sound of voices and laughter spilling out into the snowy street. Ruby stood outside for a long moment, basket in her arms, gathering her courage. "You can do this," she told herself. "You've survived worse." Had she, though? Sometimes she thought the cruelty of living was harder than the clean pain of dying. Ruby pushed open the door and stepped inside. The hall fell silent. Not completely, but enough that she felt the weight of turning heads, the quick assessments, the whispered comments. She kept her chin up, her smile fixed, and walked to the long table where the baskets were being displayed. Martha Henderson stood guard over the collection, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her thin mouth pressed into a line of perpetual disapproval. She was the self-appointed arbiter of Red Willow's morals, the kind of woman who measured virtue in inches of hemline and hours of church attendance. "Ruby," Martha said, her tone making the name sound like an accusation. "I wasn't sure you'd participate this year." "Why wouldn't I?" Ruby set her basket down on the table. "It's for a good cause." The auction proceeds went to the church roof fund, a fact that made participation practically mandatory for anyone who wanted to be considered a proper member of the community. Martha's eyes flicked to the basket, taking in the careful weaving, the pristine cloth, the generous contents. "How ambitious," she said, in a tone that suggested ambition might be a sin. Ruby didn't respond. She'd learned that engaging with Martha Henderson was like wrestling with a pig. You both got dirty, and the pig enjoyed it. She turned away and found a seat near the back of the hall, where she could watch the proceedings without being too visible. The room had filled up now, men clustered near the refreshment table, women gathered in small groups, everyone dressed in their Sunday best, everyone trying to pretend this wasn't exactly what it was, a meat market dressed up in Christmas ribbon. Ruby scanned the crowd, looking for familiar faces. There was Reverend Michaels, talking earnestly with the mayor. There was Sarah Colton, the schoolteacher, her basket no doubt filled with perfectly acceptable roasted chicken and utterly forgettable pound cake. There was Emma Brennan, daughter of the bank owner, her basket likely to fetch the highest bid of the night because Emma came with a dowry and excellent prospects. And there, standing at the very back of the hall, half hidden in the shadows near the door, was Declan Hart. Ruby's breath caught. She hadn't seen him since that day on the road. She'd heard he'd been in town a few times, picking up supplies, conducting business at the bank, but their paths hadn't crossed. She'd assumed he'd forgotten about her, the way people forgot small kindnesses, the way the world forgot inconvenient women. But he was here, and as if he felt her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded room. He nodded, just slightly, an acknowledgement that sent a flutter through Ruby's chest that she firmly told herself was ridiculous. She was a widow of 32, not a girl of 16. She had no business feeling flutters. Still, when she nodded back, she found herself smiling. The auction began with the ceremony and pageantry that Red Willow loved. Mayor Hutchins, red-faced and jovial, took his place at the podium and launched into a speech about community spirit and Christian charity that went on just long enough to become tedious. Finally, he gestured to the table of baskets. "Now, gentlemen, you all know how this works. We'll auction each basket. The winning bidder shares the meal with the lady who prepared it, and all proceeds go to repair the church roof. So dig deep, be generous, and remember, you're not just buying supper, you're investing in the spiritual well-being of our community." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The first basket went to John Parsons for $8, a respectable sum that set the tone for the evening. The second fetched 10, the third 12. Emma Brennan's basket, as predicted, sparked a bidding war between the banker's son and the lawyer's nephew, finally going for $18 amid much applause and good-natured ribbing. Ruby watched, her stomach tightening with each basket sold. Hers sat at the far end of the table, last in line, the position that told everyone exactly what the organizers thought of her participation. Always last, always least. The bidding continued. Sarah Colton's basket went for $9 to a nervous young clerk from the land office. Margaret Wilson's basket fetched $11. One by one, the table emptied, and still Ruby's basket sat there, red ribbon bright against the white cloth, waiting. Finally, inevitably, Mayor Hutchins lifted it. "And our last basket of the evening," he announced, prepared by Mrs. Ruby Lawson. The room shifted. Ruby felt it like a physical thing. The sidelong glances, the whispered comments, the awkward silence of people trying to decide how to react. Mayor Hutchins, to his credit, tried to maintain enthusiasm. "Now, gentlemen, you all know Mrs. Lawson is one of the finest bakers in the territory. I've had her bread myself, and I can testify." "Start the bidding, Samuel," Martha Henderson called out, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "We haven't got all night." Nervous laughter skittered through the crowd. "Right, well then." The mayor cleared his throat. "Shall we start at $5? Silence. Ruby stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Her face burned. Her throat ached with the effort of not crying. $5, anyone? The mayor's voice had lost its joviality. Come now, gentlemen. It's for a good cause. More silence. Someone coughed. Someone else shuffled their feet. Ruby wanted to stand up, to walk out with her head high, to spare herself and everyone else this excruciating display. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in her chair, forced to endure every second of this public rejection. Well, Mayor Hutchins said, his voice strained, perhaps we should… $30. The voice came from the back of the hall, quiet but clear, cutting through the awkward silence like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned. Declan Hart stepped out of the shadows, his hat in his hands, his winter sky eyes fixed on the mayor. I bid $30, he repeated, louder this time. The room erupted. Whispers turned to exclamations, exclamations to questions shouted across the room. $30 was more than any basket had fetched all night, more than anyone had paid in the history of Red Willow's Christmas auction, as far as Ruby could remember. Mayor Hutchins blinked, clearly stunned. $30. Do I hear 35? Going once, the mayor said when no one answered. Going twice. Ruby couldn't breathe. She stared at Declan Hart, at this man she'd helped once on a lonely road, this stranger who was now walking toward the front of the hall with steady, purposeful steps. Sold! The mayor's gavel came down with a crack. To Mr. Hart for $30. Applause broke out, scattered at first, then building, though Ruby couldn't tell if it was genuine appreciation or simple relief that the awkward moment had passed. She didn't care. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Declan reached the front of the hall and pulled a leather wallet from his coat. He counted out bills, 3 $10 notes, crisp and new, and handed them to the mayor, who accepted them with the slightly dazed expression of a man who just witnessed something he didn't quite understand. Then Declan turned to Ruby. He crossed the room in long strides, stopping in front of her chair. Up close, she could see the calluses on his hands, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he offered her a small, private smile. Mrs. Lawson, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the chatter of the crowd. Would you do me the honor of sharing this meal? Ruby found her voice, though it came out rough and unsteady. You didn't have to. The money, that's too much. It's not nearly enough, Declan said simply. He offered his hand. Ruby took it. His palm was warm and solid against hers, and when he helped her to her feet, she felt steadier than she had in 3 years. They collected the basket from the mayor, who was already moving to conclude the evening's festivities, and Declan guided Ruby toward a small table that had been set up near the window, away from the main crowd. As they walked, Ruby felt the weight of every eye in the room following them. She heard Martha Henderson's scandalized whisper to the woman beside her. She saw Emma Brennan's raised eyebrows, and Sarah Colton's sympathetic smile, and Reverend Michael's troubled frown. She didn't care. Let them stare. Let them whisper. For once in 3 long years, someone had stood up in front of the whole town and declared that she, Ruby Lawson, the fat widow, the joke, the woman they'd written off, was worth something. Worth $30. Worth being seen. They sat at the small table, and Ruby unpacked the basket with hands that trembled only slightly. She set out the fried chicken, the biscuits, the potato salad, arranging everything on the red and white cloth with care. Declan watched her, and when she finally met his eyes, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not charity, but genuine appreciation. This looks incredible, he said. It's just chicken, Ruby said, though they both knew it was much more than that. May I? Declan gestured to the chicken. Please. He took a piece, a drumstick, perfectly golden, and bit into it. The crunch of the crust was audible even over the noise of the hall. Declan's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, he looked at Ruby with something like wonder. Mrs. Lawson, he said seriously, this is the best fried chicken I've had in my entire life. Ruby laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising her. You're just being kind. I'm being honest. Declan took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. I've eaten in fancy restaurants in San Francisco. I've had my mother's Sunday dinners, and she was the best cook in County Cork. This is better. Now I know you're lying, Ruby said, but she was smiling, really smiling, and it felt like stretching a muscle that had been cramped for too long. Try me. Declan pushed the plate toward her. Taste it yourself and tell me I'm wrong. Ruby took a small piece of chicken, bit into it, and had to admit it was good. Maybe the best batch she'd ever made. The crust was perfectly seasoned, the meat juicy and tender, everything coming together in a way that felt almost magical. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the noise of the hall fading into background chatter. Other couples sat at other tables, making awkward conversation or negotiating the early stages of courtship. But Ruby felt separated from all of that, as if she and Declan existed in their own small bubble. I never properly thanked you, Declan said eventually, breaking the silence, for helping me that day on the road. It was nothing, Ruby said automatically. It wasn't nothing. Declan set down his fork and looked at her directly. I'd been out there for 2 hours before you came along. Temperature was dropping. I had food and water in the wagon, but if that storm had hit before I got back to town... He shrugged. You might have saved my life. I just gave you a ride, Ruby protested. You stopped, Declan said. A lone woman, stopping for a strange man on an empty road. That took courage. Ruby had never thought of it that way. She'd just seen someone who needed help and offered it, the way Thomas would have wanted her to. Why did you bid on my basket? She asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Declan didn't hesitate. Because I wanted to. But $30 is what I chose to pay. Declan reached for a biscuit, split it open, watched steam rise from the fluffy interior. Mrs. Lawson, Ruby, if I may, I've been in Red Willow for 6 months. I've watched how people behave here, how they treat each other. I've seen kindness, sure, but I've also seen cruelty dressed up as respectability, and I've seen how they treat you. Ruby's cheeks burned. I don't know what you... Yes, you do. Declan's voice was gentle, but firm. I've watched them whisper about you in the general store. I've seen them cross the street to avoid talking to you. I've noticed that you're always invited last and served last and acknowledged last, if at all. And tonight, I watched them sit in silence rather than bid on a basket that clearly took hours of work and considerable skill to prepare. Ruby couldn't speak. No one had ever articulated what she'd felt for 3 years, the slow accumulation of small cruelties that she'd tried so hard to pretend didn't hurt. So when I saw your basket sitting there, Declan continued, and I heard that silence, I thought, here's a chance to do something right, to say publicly what should have been said a long time ago, that you matter, that your work matters, that you deserve respect and kindness, not mockery and judgment. A tear slid down Ruby's cheek before she could stop it. She brushed it away quickly, but Declan had already seen. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to upset you. You didn't. Ruby's voice came out thick with emotion. No one said anything like that to me in a very long time. Then people here are fools, Declan said flatly. And I hope you won't mind if I keep saying it, because I plan to. Ruby looked up sharply. What do you mean? Declan smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger, lighter, almost boyish. I mean, if you're willing, I'd like to buy more of your cooking. Not at an auction, just regular-like, as a business arrangement. I can't cook worth a damn, and I'm tired of burning beans and undercooking bacon. I could use someone who knows their way around a kitchen. You want to hire me? Ruby asked, stunned. I want to pay you for your skills, yes. Fair wage, regular work, if you're interested. Declan took a bite of the potato salad and made an appreciative sound. Though, if this is the quality I can expect, I might have to take out a loan. Ruby laughed again, and this time it came easier. You can't possibly afford to pay me what this meal is worth, according to the auction. Watch me try, Declan said. What do you say? Twice a week? Maybe 3 times? I'll pay 50 cents a meal, and I'll collect from you, save you the trip out to the ranch. 50 cents a meal, 3 times a week. That was $1.50 a week, $6 a month. That was more than Ruby made from all her scattered baking jobs combined. That was enough to keep the cabin warm all winter, to buy fabric for a new dress, to finally fix the leak in the roof. That was independence. I say yes, Ruby said, before she could second-guess herself. When do you want to start? How about Monday? Declan extended his hand across the table. We have a deal? Ruby shook his hand, feeling the calluses and the warmth, feeling something shift inside her chest like a door opening after years locked shut. We have a deal, she said. The auction wound down around them. Couples finished their meals and began gathering their things, preparing to venture back out into the snowy night. Ruby and Declan lingered over the gingerbread cookies, neither seeming eager to end the evening. These, Declan said, holding up a cookie shaped like a star, are dangerous. Dangerous? Ruby raised an eyebrow. I've already eaten 4. I'm fairly certain I could eat 40. He took a bite, closed his eyes in pleasure. What's in these? Magic? Molasses, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and a little bit of black pepper, Ruby recited. Black pepper? It enhances the other spices. My grandmother's trick. Your grandmother was a genius. They packed up the remains of the meal. Not much left, given how thoroughly Declan had eaten, and Ruby found herself reluctant to say goodbye. The evening had been, she couldn't quite find the word, healing, maybe, or hopeful. Declan helped her with her coat, a courtesy so old-fashioned and unexpected that Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. They walked toward the door together, and Ruby was acutely aware of eyes following them, of Martha Henderson's pinched expression and the mayor's puzzled frown, and a dozen other reactions she couldn't quite read. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the street covered in a pristine white blanket that glittered in the lamplight. The air was crisp and cold, each breath visible, the sky above clear and spangled with stars. Can I walk you home? Declan asked. Ruby hesitated. It was only 3 blocks, and she'd walked home alone from plenty of events before. But the offer was kind, and she found she wanted his company just a little bit longer. I'd like that, she said. They walked in comfortable silence at first, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. Then Declan said, Tell me about your husband. Ruby glanced at him, surprised. Thomas? If you don't mind, I'd like to know about the man who was lucky enough to marry you. No one had asked about Thomas in over a year. People seemed to think that widows wanted to forget, that grief had an expiration date, that you should move on and stop dwelling on the past. But Ruby wanted to remember. Thomas deserved to be remembered. He was kind, she said slowly. The first thing I noticed about him was his kindness. We met at a church social, much like tonight, actually. He was new in town, working at the sawmill, and he looked so uncomfortable in his Sunday suit that I took pity on him and brought him a cup of punch. Love at first sight? Declan asked. Not quite. Ruby smiled at the memory. He spilled the punch down his shirt and was so mortified he couldn't speak. But the next week, he showed up at my father's door with a bouquet of wildflowers and an apology, and he asked if he could take me driving. And I said yes. We courted for 6 months, married in the spring. He built our cabin that summer, every board chosen with care. He wanted to fill it with children, dozens of them. Ruby's voice faltered slightly. But we only had 3 years. No children. That wasn't meant to be for us, I suppose. And then pneumonia took him so fast. One day he was fine, the next he was gone. Declan was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said finally. That's a hard kind of loss. Have you? Ruby hesitated. Have you lost someone? My wife, Declan said quietly. Sarah. She died giving birth to our daughter. The baby lived 3 days, then followed her mother. Ruby stopped walking, turned to face him. Declan, I'm so sorry. It was 4 years ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Declan looked up at the stars. I came out west to get away from the memories, to start fresh. Bought the Whitmore Ranch site unseen. Figured hard work would help me forget. Does it? No, Declan admitted. But it helps me live with remembering. They stood together in the snowy street, 2 people who'd loved and lost, who carried grief like stones in their pockets, who understood without words what it meant to survive when the person you loved hadn't. Thank you, Ruby said softly, for tonight, for the bid, for the meal, All of it. Thank you for saying yes, Declan replied, and for trusting me enough to share your story. They'd reached Ruby's cabin. Light glowed warm behind the curtains. She'd left a lamp burning, a habit from the years when Thomas would come home late, and she wanted him to see the beacon of home from down the street. This is me, Ruby said. Monday, then? Declan confirmed. I'll come by around 4 if that suits you. 4 is perfect. Declan tipped his hat. Good night, Mrs. Lawson. Ruby, she said impulsively. You can call me Ruby. Something warm flickered in Declan's eyes. Good night, Ruby. He waited until she'd climbed the steps and unlocked her door, until she'd turned and waved before he tipped his hat one more time and walked away into the snowy night. Ruby closed the door behind her and leaned against it, heart pounding, a smile she couldn't suppress spreading across her face. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Monday arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Ruby had been up since dawn, preparing the meal with a care that bordered on obsession. Roasted chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes creamy with butter, green beans she'd canned herself last summer, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and apple pie with a crust so flaky it was practically architectural. At 4 o'clock precisely, a knock sounded at her door. Ruby smoothed her apron, tucked a stray curl behind her ear, and opened the door. Declan stood on her porch, hat in hands, snowflakes dusting his shoulders. Afternoon, Ruby. Come in, she said, stepping aside. You must be freezing. Declan entered the cabin, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pine. He looked around with obvious interest, taking in the neat kitchen, the warm stove, the table set for 2. I hope you don't mind, Ruby said, following his gaze. I thought we might eat here, rather than you taking the food back to the ranch. It's such a long, cold ride, and everything will be warm this way. Mind? Declan smiled. Ruby, this is the most welcoming place I've seen since I left Ireland. They sat at the table, and Ruby served the food with hands that trembled only slightly. Declan ate with the same obvious pleasure he'd shown at the auction, making appreciative sounds that would have been comical if they hadn't been so clearly genuine. This chicken, he said after his 3rd helping, should be illegal. Why illegal? Because it's so good it's probably a sin. Gluttony, I think. Maybe pride, because I'm certainly proud to be eating it. Ruby laughed. I don't think enjoying good food counts as sin. Then the church owes me an apology for several very boring sermons. They talked as they ate, easy conversation that ranged from the weather to ranch work to memories of places they'd lived. Declan told her about growing up in Ireland, about the green hills and the constant rain, about crossing the Atlantic in steerage and arriving in America with $5 and infinite hope. Ruby told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's blacksmith shop, about learning to cook at her mother's elbow while her brothers learned to work iron. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Declan pulled out his wallet and counted out bills. 50 cents, as promised, he said, handing Ruby the money, and worth every penny. Ruby took the money, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her apron pocket. It felt significant somehow, that first payment, proof that she had value beyond what the town said about her. Same time Wednesday? Declan asked. Same time Wednesday, Ruby agreed. At the door, Declan paused. Ruby, would you mind if I asked you something? Of course not. Would you teach me? Ruby blinked. Teach you what? To cook, not like this. I know I'll never manage anything this fine, but basic things. How to make bread that doesn't turn into a brick. How to fry an egg without burning it. How to make food that tastes like someone cares. Ruby studied his face, saw genuine interest there, and something else. Loneliness, maybe, or the desire for connection. I'd be happy to, she said. We can start Wednesday if you like. Declan's smile was like sunrise. I'd like that very much. Wednesday became Friday, became Monday again, and suddenly Ruby had a routine, a rhythm to her weeks that felt like music after years of silence. Declan came faithfully every other day, sometimes 3 times a week if the weather was good. They'd share a meal, and then Ruby would teach him the basics of cooking, how to knead bread, how to season meat, how to tell when vegetables were done. Declan was a terrible student in the best possible way. He burned things, oversalted things, created culinary disasters that had them both laughing until tears ran down their faces. But he listened carefully when Ruby explained techniques, practiced diligently between visits, and slowly, gradually, began to improve. More than that, he talked. He told her about his days on the ranch, about the cattle he was raising, about his plans for the property. He asked her questions about her life, about Thomas, about her dreams and fears and memories. And he listened, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing her words like they mattered. In Ruby's small kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of the stove and the smell of baking bread, something began to grow between them. Not romance, not yet, or maybe not exactly romance, but something deeper and more fundamental. Companionship, trust, the recognition of kindred spirits who'd both walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged on the other side, scarred but surviving. December deepened into true winter. Snow piled high in the streets, ice formed on the windows. And through it all, Declan kept coming, kept eating Ruby's cooking, kept sitting at her table and filling her cabin with laughter. The town noticed, of course. Martha Henderson made pointed comments at the general store about the impropriety of a widow entertaining a single man without a chaperone. The mayor's wife stopped Ruby on the street to ask, with false sweetness, if she was keeping company with Mr. Hart. Reverend Michaels delivered a sermon about the appearance of evil that everyone knew was directed at Ruby, though he was too cowardly to say her name from the pulpit. Ruby tried to ignore it. She and Declan were doing nothing wrong. They shared meals, that was all. He paid her for cooking, she taught him kitchen skills. It was a business arrangement, except it wasn't, not really, and they both knew it. It became something more on a Friday afternoon in mid-December, when Declan arrived for his usual visit and found Ruby crying at her kitchen table. She tried to hide it, turning away quickly and dabbing at her eyes with her apron, but Declan had already seen. "Ruby?" He crossed the room in 2 strides. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm fine. Ruby's voice broke. "You're clearly not fine." Declan pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Tell me." Ruby shook her head, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "Please," Declan said gently. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." The kindness in his voice broke something loose inside her. "I went to the bank today," she managed, "to ask about a loan. The roof needs repairs before winter gets worse, and I thought maybe with the money I'm earning from you I could afford the payments." "And?" Declan prompted when she fell silent. "Mr. Brennan said no. Said a woman alone wasn't a good risk. Said I should remarry if I wanted financial stability, find a man to take care of me." Ruby laughed bitterly. "As if any man in this town would want me." "Ruby." "He's right, isn't he?" Ruby looked up at Declan with streaming eyes. "I'm too fat, too old, too much of a burden. I'm just the woman people whisper about, the joke, the fat widow who doesn't know her place." "Stop." Declan's voice was sharp enough to cut through her spiral. "Don't you dare say those things about yourself." "Why not? Everyone else does." "Everyone else is wrong." Declan reached out and took her hands, his grip warm and solid. "Ruby, listen to me. You are not too anything. You're exactly right. You're kind and talented and brave and—" He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said more than he meant to. Ruby stared at him, her heart pounding. "And what?" Declan took a breath, seemed to come to some internal decision. "And beautiful. You're beautiful, Ruby. Not despite your body, but including it. You're warm and soft and real, and when you smile, you light up the whole room." Ruby couldn't breathe. No one had called her beautiful in 3 years. No one had looked at her the way Declan was looking at her now, like she was something precious. "I want to court you," Declan said quietly. "Properly, publicly, so the whole damn town knows I'm serious. I know it's fast, I know people will talk, but Ruby, I can't keep pretending this is just about the cooking. I look forward to these visits all week. I think about you when I'm working. I want to be here, with you, as much as possible." "Declan?" Ruby whispered. "You don't have to answer now," Declan said quickly. "Think about it." I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm a struggling rancher with more debts than cattle, and I have my own grief to carry. But I promise I'll treat you well. I promise I'll defend you against every cruel word and stupid opinion in this town. I promise I'll never make you feel like you're too much or not enough. You'll always be exactly right with me." Ruby looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers wrapped around hers, strong and steady. Thomas had been gone for 3 years. She'd mourned him, would always mourn him in her way. But he was gone, and she was alive, and maybe she deserved to live fully again, to open her heart to the possibility of love a second time. "Yes," she said softly. Declan's head snapped up. "Yes? Yes, I'll court you. Yes to all of it." Ruby met his eyes, saw joy there, and felt an answering joy bloom in her own chest. "But Declan, the town will be merciless. They already talk. If we're public about this—" "Let them talk," Declan said fiercely. "Let them say whatever they want. I've faced down storms and starvation and the death of everyone I loved most. I can handle a few small-minded gossips." Ruby laughed through her tears. "You don't know, Martha Henderson." "Then I'll learn." Declan raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, gentle and reverent. "We'll face her together. We'll face all of them together." And in that moment, in her small, warm kitchen with Declan's hand in hers and hope kindling in her heart, Ruby believed him. She believed they could. The next morning, Ruby woke to find the world transformed. Not the weather, though more snow had fallen overnight, covering Red Willow in fresh white, but her own heart, which felt lighter than it had in years. She lay in bed for a long moment, watching pale winter light filter through the frost-patterned windows, and let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten: anticipation. Declan was coming for supper tonight, not as a customer, not as a student, but as her suitor. The word felt strange and wonderful in her mind, like trying on a dress she'd thought she'd never wear again. She rose and went about her morning routine with unusual energy, humming as she stoked the fire, actually smiling at her reflection as she pinned up her hair. The face that looked back at her was the same one that had stared mournfully from the mirror for 3 years. Round cheeks, soft chin, lines around her eyes, but somehow it looked different now. Softer, maybe. Or maybe just less lonely. Ruby was halfway through mixing dough for dinner rolls when someone pounded on her door with enough force to rattle the hinges. She froze, flour dusting her hands, her heart suddenly racing. That wasn't Declan's knock. His was always courteous, measured. This was aggressive, demanding. The pounding came again, followed by a voice she knew all too well. "Ruby Lawson, open this door immediately!" Martha Henderson. Ruby's stomach dropped. She considered pretending she wasn't home, but Martha had probably seen smoke from the chimney, had probably been watching the cabin all morning waiting for her opportunity. There was no escape. Ruby wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Martha stood on the porch, flanked by 2 other women from the church ladies' auxiliary. Mrs. Hutchins, the mayor's wife, round and flushed with perpetual nervousness, and Mrs. Brennan, the banker's wife, thin and severe as a winter branch. All 3 women wore expressions of righteous indignation that made Ruby's blood run cold. "Good morning," Ruby said, keeping her voice steady. "Can I help you with something?" "You most certainly can," Martha said crisply. "You can explain yourself." "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Don't play coy with us, Ruby." Martha pushed past her into the cabin without invitation, the other 2 women following like ducklings behind their mother. "We've come to discuss your behavior with Mr. Hart." Ruby closed the door slowly, buying herself time to think. "My behavior?" "You've been entertaining him here," Mrs. Hutchins said, her voice quavering with scandal. "Alone, without a chaperone, multiple times a week." "Mr. Hart is my client," Ruby said carefully. "I cook for him. He pays me. It's a business arrangement." "Business?" Mrs. Brennan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My husband tells me you came begging for a loan yesterday. What kind of businesswoman can't manage her own finances?" The cruelty of it stole Ruby's breath for a moment. She'd gone to the bank in confidence, had shared her financial struggles in what she'd thought was a private conversation. Of course, Mr. Brennan had told his wife. Of course, his wife had told Martha. Privacy was a luxury women like Ruby couldn't afford. "My finances are my own concern," Ruby said, lifting her chin. "Not when your solution to poverty is entertaining men without proper supervision," Martha shot back. Do you have any idea how this looks? A widow, alone with a bachelor behind closed doors? We share meals, Ruby said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. He's teaching himself to cook. There's nothing improper about it. Then why not invite a chaperone? Mrs. Hutchins asked, wringing her hands. Why not have these lessons at the community hall where people can see that nothing untoward is happening? Because it's my home, Ruby said. Because I have the right to invite guests into my own home without asking permission from the town gossips. Martha's eyes narrowed. Gossips? Is that what we are for caring about moral standards in our community? You're not caring about morals, Ruby said, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. You're caring about appearances. You don't actually give a damn about my virtue. If you did, you would have helped me when Thomas died instead of whispering about my weight and crossing the street to avoid me. This isn't about morality. This is about control. How dare you? Mrs. Brennan breathed. No, how dare you? Ruby countered. How dare you come into my home and accuse me of impropriety when all I've done is earn an honest living? How dare you judge me for finding a friend when this town has treated me like a pariah for 3 years? A friend? Martha's voice dripped with skepticism. Is that what Mr. Hart is to you? Ruby hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Martha pounced. You see? She can't even deny it. This has gone beyond business, beyond friendship. This woman is carrying on with a man outside the bonds of marriage, and she expects us to turn a blind eye. I'm not carrying on with anyone, Ruby protested. Then what would you call it? Mrs. Hutchins asked, genuine curiosity breaking through her nervousness. Ruby took a deep breath. He's courting me, properly and respectfully. We're getting to know each other with the intention of possibly marrying, if things work out. There's nothing scandalous about that. The three women exchanged glances that Ruby couldn't quite read. Courting, Martha repeated slowly. And when exactly did this courtship begin? Yesterday, Ruby admitted. He asked yesterday and I said yes. But the visits have been happening for weeks, Mrs. Brennan pointed out. Weeks of you alone with him, before this sudden decision to make it proper. We weren't alone in any improper sense, Ruby said desperately. We were in the kitchen, cooking, talking. Talking, Martha interrupted. Yes, I'm sure that's all that happened. Just talking. The insinuation hung in the air like poison. Ruby felt tears of frustration prick her eyes. Nothing happened. We've been completely proper. The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as the act itself, Martha said primly. Surely you understand that. A widow must be above reproach, a woman in your position especially. There it was, the thing they always came back to. A woman in your position. Fat. Undesirable. Lucky to have any attention at all, so who was she to demand respect? Get out, Ruby said quietly. Martha blinked. Excuse me? Get out of my house. Ruby crossed to the door and held it open. I've listened to your concerns. I've explained myself. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted in my own home any longer. Ruby, we're only trying to help, Mrs. Hutchins said weakly. No, you're not. You're trying to shame me into compliance. You're trying to make me feel small and wrong for daring to be happy. Well, I won't do it. I've spent 3 years making myself small for this town, and I'm done. You'll regret this defiance, Mrs. Brennan warned, rising from her chair. There are consequences for women who refuse to behave properly. Then I'll face them, Ruby said, her voice shaking but her resolve firm. Now please leave. Martha drew herself up to her full height, her face pinched with fury. Very well. But don't say we didn't warn you, Ruby Lawson. This town has standards, and we will enforce them. The three women swept out in a rustle of skirts and wounded dignity. Ruby closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd stood up to Martha Henderson. She'd defended herself and Declan and their right to court without interference. She'd also, she realized with growing dread, probably made everything much, much worse. Ruby returned to her bread dough on shaking legs, but the joy had gone out of the morning. She kneaded mechanically, her mind churning with worry. What had Martha meant by consequences? What could they actually do to her? She was still pondering this when Declan arrived that evening, stamping snow from his boots on her porch before knocking. Ruby opened the door and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. Martha Henderson came by this morning with Mrs. Hutchins and Mrs. Brennan. They know. About us. About the courting. Declan stepped inside and closed the door carefully behind him. What did they say? Ruby told him everything. The accusations, the insinuations, the thinly veiled threats. Declan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each detail. I'm sorry, Ruby finished miserably. I shouldn't have told them. I should have just kept quiet about the courting until... Until when? Declan interrupted gently. Ruby, we can't court in secret. That would actually be improper. You told them the truth and there's no shame in that. But the things they said were cruel and small-minded, Declan said firmly. And I don't give a damn what Martha Henderson thinks about anything. Despite her worry, Ruby felt a small smile tug at her lips. You should. She's the most powerful woman in Red Willow. Then Red Willow needs to elect better women. Declan shrugged out of his coat. What's for supper? Something smells incredible. Ruby blinked at the sudden change of subject. Roast beef and potatoes. But Declan, we need to talk about this. We can talk over dinner, Declan said. I'm starving, and I refuse to let Martha Henderson ruin a good meal. They sat at the table, and Ruby served the food with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Declan ate with his usual appreciation, making comfortable conversation about his day on the ranch, about a cow that had given birth that morning, about his plans for spring planting. It was so normal, so domestic, that Ruby felt her anxiety begin to ease. Maybe Declan was right. Maybe Martha couldn't actually do anything beyond gossip and glare. After dinner, Declan helped Ruby with the dishes, something he'd started doing without being asked, and that always made her heart warm. They worked side by side at the basin, his hands soapy and competent, her hands drying and putting away, a rhythm they'd developed without discussion. Ruby, Declan said as he handed her the last plate, I want you to know something. What's that? I'm not afraid of them. The town, the gossips, the moral guardians. I'm not afraid of what they might say or do. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing you because you think I can't handle the pressure. Ruby set down the dish towel and turned to face him. I don't think that. Good. Because I meant what I said yesterday. I want to court you properly, which means I want to be seen with you. I want to walk you to church on Sunday. I want to escort you to community events. I want everyone in Red Willow to know that you're mine and I'm yours, if you'll have me. Declan, I know it won't be easy, he continued. I know people will talk. But I also know that hiding our feelings, sneaking around like we're doing something wrong, that would be so much worse. For both of us. Ruby studied his face, seeing determination there, and something deeper. Something that looked like love, though it was too soon to call it that. Wasn't it? You're right, she said slowly. You're absolutely right. We haven't done anything wrong, and we shouldn't act like we have. Exactly, Declan smiled. So, Sunday, may I escort you to church? Ruby thought about the stares they'd receive, the whispers, Martha's scandalized expression. Then she thought about walking alone as she'd done for 3 years, about sitting isolated in her pew, about going home to an empty cabin. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much. Declan's smile widened into a grin. Then it's a date. Our first public outing as a courting couple. God help us, Ruby said, but she was smiling too. After Declan left that night, Ruby sat by her fire and tried to imagine Sunday. She pictured walking into church on Declan's arm, pictured the reactions, tried to prepare herself for the onslaught of judgment. But underneath the worry, she felt something else, pride. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to apologize for existing, for taking up space, for daring to be courted and cared for. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She had Declan, and he had her, and maybe that was enough. Sunday morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of winter day that made every breath visible and turned noses red within minutes of stepping outside. Ruby dressed with unusual care, choosing her best dress, dark blue wool that Thomas had bought her for their 2nd anniversary. It was a little snug now, the fabric pulling across her hips and bust in ways that would probably give Martha Henderson a heart attack. Ruby looked at herself in the mirror and decided she didn't care. Declan arrived at exactly 9:30, dressed in a suit that looked new, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine. He held out his arm without a word, and Ruby took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric. They walked down Main Street toward the white clapboard church, and Ruby was intensely aware of curtains twitching in windows, of doors opening just a crack, of eyes watching their progress. By the time they reached the church steps, she knew half the town had seen them. Good. Let the gossip start early. Inside, the church was already filling up with the faithful and the curious. Ruby had been attending the same church for 5 years, always arriving early to slip into the back pew where she could be unobtrusive. Today, with Declan beside her, she walked down the center aisle to a pew in the middle of the church and sat down like she had every right to be there. Because she did have every right. The whispers started immediately. Ruby heard Martha's scandalized gasp from 2 rows back. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the rustle of turned heads, the suspended breath of collective shock. Declan seemed completely unbothered. He helped Ruby with her coat, made sure she was comfortable, then sat beside her with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't give a damn who disapproved. Reverend Michaels entered and the service began, but Ruby barely heard the opening hymn. Her awareness was fixed on the man beside her, on the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers, on the way he shared the hymnal with her even though he clearly didn't know the words. The sermon was about forgiveness, about loving thy neighbor, about not casting stones. Ruby wondered if Reverend Michaels had chosen the topic deliberately, if this was his gentle way of reminding the congregation that judgment was God's domain, not theirs. If so, Martha Henderson missed the message entirely. After the service, she positioned herself at the church door like a sentry, her face tight with disapproval as people filed past. Ruby and Declan were among the last to leave. As they approached, Martha stepped directly into their path. "Mr. Hart," she said, ignoring Ruby completely. "Might I have a word?" "You may," Declan said pleasantly, "though I suspect you're going to have it whether I grant permission or not." A few nearby congregants chuckled, then quickly disguised it as coughs. Martha's lips thinned. "I feel it's my Christian duty to warn you that you're being talked about. You and Mrs. Lawson. The nature of your association is causing concern among the good people of this community." "Then the good people of this community need more interesting lives," Declan said mildly. "Mrs. Lawson and I are courting. There's nothing scandalous about it." "Courting requires supervision," Martha insisted, "a chaperone to ensure propriety." "We're both adults who have been married before," Declan pointed out. "I'm fairly certain we can manage propriety without a babysitter." Someone behind them snorted with laughter. Ruby didn't turn to see who, but she felt a surge of gratitude for whoever it was. Martha's face reddened. "Your flippancy doesn't change the facts, Mr. Hart. Mrs. Lawson has been entertaining you unchaperoned for weeks. That is a moral concern." "The only thing that should concern you is how good her cooking is," Declan said, his pleasant tone developing an edge. "Which you'd know if you'd bothered to bid on her basket at the auction instead of sitting there in judgment." Martha gasped. "How dare you?" "I dare because someone needs to," Declan interrupted. "You've spent years treating Ruby like she's somehow less than the rest of you. You've whispered about her weight, mocked her widowhood, excluded her from your social circles. And now that someone sees her value, now that someone wants to court her, you're scandalized?" "No, ma'am. The scandal is how you've behaved toward a woman who's done nothing but try to survive in a town that seems determined to make her miserable." The small crowd that had gathered fell silent. Ruby could see shock on multiple faces, approval on a few others. Mrs. Hutchins was crying quietly into her handkerchief. Martha stood frozen, her mouth working soundlessly. "Now, if you'll excuse us," Declan said, offering Ruby his arm again, "we have a dinner engagement." They walked past Martha's rigid figure, past the gaping crowd, down the church steps and into the bright cold morning. Ruby didn't speak until they were halfway down the street. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Declan's voice was still tight with anger. "I've listened to the way they talk to you, the way they talk about you. I'm done being polite about it. You've made an enemy of Martha Henderson." She was already my enemy the moment I bid on your basket. Declan stopped walking and turned to face Ruby. Listen to me. I don't care about Martha Henderson's good opinion. I don't care about this town's moral judgments. The only opinion I care about is yours. Are you angry with me for speaking out? Ruby thought about the shocked faces, about Martha's humiliation, about the way Declan had defended her in front of half the congregation. No, she said finally. I'm not angry. I'm grateful. And a little terrified of what comes next. What comes next is dinner, Declan said firmly. I believe you promised me pot roast? Ruby laughed, the sound surprised out of her. I did, didn't I? They continued to Ruby's cabin, and as they walked, Ruby noticed something new. A few people nodded to them in passing. Mrs. Morrison actually smiled and called out a greeting. Even Mr. Perkins from the general store tipped his hat. Maybe Declan's public defense had done more than just anger Martha. Maybe it had given other people permission to treat Ruby with kindness again. The pot roast was perfect, the potatoes tender, the carrots sweet and butter soft. They ate with the comfortable ease of people who'd shared many meals, talking about everything and nothing. After dinner, Declan taught Ruby a card game his father had taught him back in Ireland. They played for matchsticks at the kitchen table, laughing when Ruby won 3 hands in a row, arguing good-naturedly about the rules. It was domestic and simple and exactly what Ruby needed after the drama of the morning. As the winter sun began to set, painting the snow outside in shades of pink and gold, Declan stood to leave. Same time Tuesday? He asked, shrugging into his coat. Same time Tuesday, Ruby confirmed. At the door, Declan hesitated. Ruby, I want you to prepare yourself. Martha isn't going to let this go. She'll retaliate somehow. I know, Ruby said, but Declan, whatever happens, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're doing this. Declan's expression softened. He reached out and touched her cheek, gentle and careful, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. Ruby didn't pull away. I'm glad too, Declan said softly. Then he tipped his hat and stepped out into the snowy evening. Ruby watched him go, her hand pressed to the cheek he'd touched, her heart full and frightened in equal measure. Tuesday came, then Friday, then Monday again. Declan's visits became the rhythm of Ruby's weeks, the things she looked forward to, the bright spots in the gray winter days. They cooked together, talked for hours, slowly learned each other's stories and scars. The town continued to gossip, but the edge seemed to have gone out of it. People still whispered, but they also nodded greetings on the street. They still judged, but they also showed up at Ruby's door to buy her bread, to request her pies for special occasions. Ruby dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would settle down. She should have known better. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-January when Martha made her move. Ruby was in her kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's batch of bread, when heavy footsteps sounded on her porch, followed by an authoritative knock. She opened the door to find Mayor Hutchins standing there, flanked by Reverend Michaels and Mr. Brennan. All 3 men looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Lawson, the mayor said formally, may we come in? Ruby's stomach dropped, but she stepped aside. Of course. The men filed in, taking off their hats, looking anywhere but at her. What's this about? Ruby asked, though she suspected she already knew. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat. Mrs. Lawson, I'm here in my official capacity as mayor and head of the town council. We've received concerns about your behavior with Mr. Hart. What kind of concerns? Ruby asked, even as her heart sank. Multiple citizens have reported seeing Mr. Hart entering and leaving your home at unusual hours, staying for extended periods, alone with you without proper supervision. The mayor consulted a paper in his hands. The council has reviewed these reports and determined that your conduct constitutes a moral disruption to the community. Ruby felt like she'd been slapped. A moral disruption? Now, Ruby, Reverend Michaels interjected gently, no one is suggesting anything untoward has actually occurred, but you must understand how it looks. A widow, a bachelor, frequent private meetings. I'm being courted, Ruby said, her voice rising. That's not a crime. No, but it requires discretion, Mr. Brennan said stiffly. Discretion you have not shown. We've been completely proper, Ruby protested. We're just... The appearance of impropriety is sufficient cause for concern, Mayor Hutchins said, clearly reciting from something he'd memorized. Therefore, the council has voted to issue you an official warning. If these private meetings continue without a chaperone present, further action will be taken. Further action? Ruby repeated faintly. What does that mean? The three men exchanged glances. It means, Mr. Brennan said finally, that the council has the authority to ask you to leave Red Willow for the moral good of the community. Ruby stared at him, certain she must have misheard. You're threatening to exile me? It's not exile, Reverend Michaels said quickly. It's just a request that you relocate for everyone's sake. Because I'm being courted, Ruby said slowly, trying to make sense of it. Because a man wants to marry me, you're threatening to drive me out of town? Because you refuse to conduct yourself with proper decorum, Mr. Brennan corrected. If you would simply agree to have a chaperone present during Mr. Hart's visits, this could all be resolved. Ruby thought about what that would mean. Martha or one of her cronies sitting in her kitchen, watching every word, every gesture, poisoning the easy companionship she and Declan had built. No, she said. Mayor Hutchins blinked. No. No, Ruby repeated more firmly. I won't live my life under surveillance to satisfy this town's paranoia. Declan and I have done nothing wrong. We're adults conducting a proper courtship, and I won't apologize for that. Then you leave us no choice, Mr. Brennan said coldly. This is your official warning, Mrs. Lawson. If the behavior continues, you will be asked to leave Red Willow by the end of the month. They filed out, leaving Ruby standing in her kitchen, flour still dusting her hands, her whole world crumbling around her. She had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to either submit to the town's demands or lose the only home she'd known since Thomas died. 2 weeks to choose between love and survival. Ruby sank into a chair, buried her face in her floury hands, and let herself cry. She didn't know how long she sat there, tears soaking into her floury hands, her chest tight with the unfairness of it all. The cabin around her felt both like a fortress and a prison. The home Thomas had built, the walls that had sheltered her through 3 years of grief, now threatened to be torn away because she dared to let someone in. Ruby was still sitting there when she heard boots on the porch again. Her heart lurched, thinking the council had returned with more threats, but the knock that followed was familiar, gentle. Declan. She wiped her face hastily with her apron and opened the door. He took one look at her red eyes and flour-streaked cheeks, and his expression hardened. What happened? He asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Ruby told him everything, the words spilling out in a rush, the council's visit, the accusations, the ultimatum. With each sentence, Declan's jaw grew tighter, his eyes colder. They can't do this, he said when she finished. They can't exile you for courting. Apparently they can, Ruby said bitterly. For moral disruption, for the good of the community. She laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. I've lived here for 5 years. I've baked bread for their church socials and donated to their roof fund and never caused a moment's trouble. But the second I have something that makes me happy, the second I'm not sufficiently miserable, I'm a disruption that needs to be removed. Declan paced the small kitchen like a caged animal. This is Martha's doing. She went to the council. Of course she did, Ruby said, and they listened. Because she's respectable and I'm the fat widow who doesn't know her place. Stop. Declan crossed to her, took her shoulders in his hands. Stop saying things like that about yourself. This isn't about you not knowing your place. This is about them not liking that your place isn't beneath their feet anymore. Whoa. Ruby wanted to believe him, but the weight of the council's judgment sat heavy on her chest. Maybe they're right, though. Maybe we have been improper. Maybe we should have had a chaperone from the beginning. No. Declan's voice was firm. We've done nothing wrong. We're 2 adults who've been married before, who know our own minds. We don't need a babysitter, and we don't need Martha Henderson's approval to live our lives. But if I don't comply, they'll make me leave, Ruby whispered. This is my home, Declan. Thomas built this cabin. His hands touched every board, every nail. How can I just abandon it? Declan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, almost hesitant. What if you didn't have to? Ruby looked up at him. What do you mean? What if there was a way to stay in Red Willow, to keep your home, and to tell the council and Martha and all of them to go to hell? There isn't, Ruby said. Not unless we agree to their terms. There's one way, Declan said slowly. One way that would make all of this moot. Ruby's heart began to pound. Declan, marry me. The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful. Ruby stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? Marry me, Declan repeated, and now he was smiling, that slow, warm smile that made her feel like sunshine. Not someday. Not after a proper courtship period. Now, this week, before they can enforce their deadline. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Declan took her hands, his grip warm and steady. Ruby, I know this is fast. I know we've only been courting for a few weeks. But I also know that I look forward to seeing you more than anything else in my life. I know that when I'm with you, I feel less alone than I have since Sarah died. I know that you're kind and brave and strong, and that I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth making you smile. Declan, you don't have to do this, Ruby said, even as hope kindled dangerously in her chest. You don't have to marry me to save me from exile. That's not a good enough reason. You're right, it's not, Declan agreed. But that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because I want to, because I was going to ask eventually anyway, and they've just forced my hand on the timing. Because I want you to be my wife, Ruby. I want to wake up next to you and eat your cooking and teach you Irish songs and watch you laugh. I want all of it, every day for as long as we both live. Ruby felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were different. Not tears of despair, but of overwhelming emotion. We barely know each other. We know enough, Declan said. We know we've both loved and lost. We know we're both strong enough to survive grief. We know we make each other happy. What else is there to know that we can't learn as we go? Your ranch, Ruby said desperately, grasping at objections. Your business. If you marry me, the council might come after you too. Mr. Brennan could call in your loans. The mayor could make trouble with your land claims. You could lose everything. I won't lose everything, Declan said firmly. I'll have you. And Ruby, listen to me. Property and money and the good opinion of small-minded men, none of that matters if I'm alone. None of it matters if I let fear stop me from building something real with you. Ruby searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was just a noble gesture he'd come to regret. She found only certainty, solid and unshakable. What if it doesn't work? She whispered. What if we marry and then realize we've made a terrible mistake? Then we'll have made it together, Declan said, and we'll figure it out together. But Ruby, I don't think we're making a mistake. I think we're making the best decision either of us could make. Ruby thought about the empty cabin, the lonely years, the slow suffocation of living in a town that wanted her to disappear. Then she thought about Declan's laughter filling her kitchen, about having someone to talk to at the end of long days, about waking up knowing she mattered to another human being. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared, about how he'd want her to be happy. He wouldn't want her to be alone forever, wouldn't want her to sacrifice joy out of some misguided loyalty to his memory. Yes, she said, the word barely a breath. Declan's eyes widened. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Ruby laughed through her tears. You're probably insane, and I'm definitely insane for agreeing, but yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Declan let out a whoop of joy that startled a laugh out of her. He picked her up and spun her around, right there in the small kitchen, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that Ruby felt her heart crack open. I'm going to make you happy, he promised. I'm going to spend every day of my life trying to make you happy. You already do, Ruby said. Declan kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a promise sealed with lips and breath and hope. It was Ruby's first kiss since Thomas died, and it felt like coming home and setting out on a new journey all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Declan rested his forehead against hers. We need to tell Reverend Michaels, he said. Get him to perform the ceremony before the council can interfere. Ruby's euphoria dimmed slightly. He was there today, with the mayor and Mr. Brennan. He's part of this. He's also a man of God who can't refuse to marry two willing adults, Declan pointed out. And he's always been kind to you, hasn't he? Kinder than the others? Ruby had to admit that was true. Reverend Michaels had bid on her basket that first year, had visited after Thomas died, had never been overtly cruel even when the rest of the town turned cold. It's worth trying, she said. Then we'll go see him, tomorrow morning, first thing. Declan squeezed her hands. We'll tell him we want to marry, and we'll ask him to perform the ceremony this week. This week, Ruby repeated, the reality of it hitting her. Declan, I don't have a dress. I don't have rings. I don't have anything prepared. We don't need any of that, Declan said firmly. We just need each other, and a reverend willing to say the words. Everything else is just decoration. Ruby knew he was right, but still. She'd dreamed of her wedding to Thomas for months, had sewn her own dress, had planned every detail. This would be so different, hasty, spare, born of necessity as much as love. But maybe that was fitting. Her life with Thomas had been one thing. Her life with Declan would be another. Different didn't mean lesser. Okay, she said. Tomorrow morning, we'll talk to Reverend Michaels. Declan stayed for another hour, helping her finish the bread she'd abandoned, talking through the logistics of what came next. Where would they live? His ranch or her cabin? How would they combine their households? What would they tell people? We'll tell them the truth, Declan said, that we're getting married because we want to, because we're in love, because we choose each other. Let them make of that what they will. Ruby liked the sound of that. Let them make of that what they will. Let Martha and the council and all the gossips choke on their own judgment. After Declan left, Ruby sat by her fire and let herself imagine it. Being Mrs. Hart, sharing a life with someone again, having a partner, a companion, someone to face the world with instead of always standing alone. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She slept fitfully that night, her dreams full of wedding ceremonies that kept transforming into council meetings, of Declan's smile flickering like candlelight. She woke before dawn, exhausted but determined. Declan arrived just after breakfast, dressed in his Sunday suit, his hair still damp from washing. Together they walked to the small house behind the church where Reverend Michaels lived with his wife and 3 children. The Reverend answered the door in his shirt sleeves, looking startled to see them. Mr. Hart, Mrs. Lawson, this is unexpected. We apologize for the early hour, Declan said, but we have an urgent matter to discuss. May we come in? Reverend Michaels glanced over his shoulder, where his wife could be heard organizing breakfast for the children, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Perhaps we should talk out here. What's this about? We want to get married, Declan said simply. This week, if possible. The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. This week? But you've only been courting for— We know how long we've been courting, Ruby interrupted, and we know our own minds. We want to marry, Reverend. We're asking you to perform the ceremony. Reverend Michaels looked between them, his expression troubled. I appreciate that you're both eager, but marriage is a serious commitment. Perhaps a longer engagement would be wise. Give you time to know each other properly, to prepare— We don't have time, Declan said bluntly. The council has given Ruby until the end of the month to either submit to their supervision or leave Red Willow. We're choosing a third option. Understanding dawned on the Reverend's face, followed quickly by dismay. Mr. Hart, you can't marry someone just to circumvent the council's decision. I'm not, Declan said firmly. I'm marrying Ruby because I love her, because I want to spend my life with her. The timing is forced by circumstances, yes, but the decision itself has nothing to do with the council. Ruby, Reverend Michaels said gently, turning to her. Is this truly what you want, or are you feeling pressured by the situation? Ruby met his eyes steadily. I want this, Reverend. I want to marry Declan, not because I'm being forced to, but because he makes me happy. Because I'm tired of being alone. Because I believe we can build a good life together. The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Ruby could see the internal struggle on his face, the desire to help warring with concern about appearances, about what the council would say. If I do this, he said finally. If I marry you this week, the council will be furious. They'll see it as defiance of their authority. Then let them be furious, Declan said. Reverend, you were there yesterday when they issued their ultimatum. Do you truly believe Ruby deserves to be exiled for the crime of being courted? Do you think that's justice? Reverend Michaels winced. No, I don't. I argued against it for what it's worth, but I was outvoted. Then help us, Ruby pleaded. You have the power to make this right, to let us choose our own path instead of having it dictated by Martha Henderson's moral panic. The Reverend closed his eyes briefly, clearly wrestling with the decision. When he opened them, he looked weary but resolved. Friday, he said. I'll perform the ceremony Friday morning before the council can organize any opposition. But Ruby, Declan, you need to understand, this will have consequences. The council won't take this lightly. We understand, Declan said, and we're prepared to face whatever comes. Very well. Reverend Michaels straightened his shoulders. Friday at 10 o'clock at the church. I'll need 2 witnesses. Can you arrange that? We can, Ruby said, though she had no idea who would be willing to stand with them against the council's wrath. After they left the Reverend's house, Ruby and Declan stood in the snowy street, the reality of what they'd just set in motion settling over them. We're really doing this, Ruby said. We're really doing this, Declan confirmed. Any second thoughts? Ruby considered the question seriously. Was she afraid? Yes. Was she uncertain about the future? Absolutely. But did she regret saying yes? No second thoughts, she said. You? Not a single one. Declan offered his arm. Come on. We have a wedding to plan, and only 3 days to do it. Those 3 days passed in a blur. Ruby cleaned her cabin from top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because she needed something to do with her anxious energy. She baked bread and pies, filling her small home with the comfort of familiar smells. She took apart the blue dress she'd worn to church and re-sewed it, taking it in where she could, adding a bit of lace at the collar that she'd been saving for years. Declan came by each evening, ostensibly to help, but mostly just to be there. They talked about everything, where they'd live, how they'd merge their lives, what they wanted for the future. They decided to keep both properties, spending winters in Ruby's cabin in town and summers at Declan's ranch. They talked about expanding Declan's cattle operation, about Ruby selling her baking to the new restaurant opening on Main Street, about maybe, someday, having children if God saw fit. They talked about everything except what would happen when the council found out. On Thursday evening, Declan brought her a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. I sent for it weeks ago, he admitted. Before I even asked you to court me, I knew I wanted to marry you. I just thought we'd have more time. Ruby slipped the ring on her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been made for her. It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you, Declan said, and Ruby had learned enough about him to know he meant it. That night, Ruby lay in bed and thought about the next day, about standing in the church and promising her life to someone she'd known for less than 2 months. It should have felt rushed, desperate, wrong. Instead, it felt like the first right thing she'd done in 3 years. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, with snow threatening but not yet falling. Ruby dressed in her altered blue dress, pinned up her hair with extra care, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a bride. Not a young bride, not a thin bride, not the kind of bride the town would approve of, but a bride nonetheless, with hope in her eyes and love in her heart. There was a knock at her door at 9:30. Ruby opened it expecting Declan, but instead found Mrs. Morrison standing there, wrapped in a heavy cloak and holding a small bouquet of winter greenery and dried flowers. I heard, the older woman said simply, about the wedding. I thought you might like these. Every bride should have flowers. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. Mrs. Morrison, I thank you. I'll stand as your witness, Mrs. Morrison continued. If you'll have me. I know the council won't like it, but I'm too old to care what they think anymore. Ruby hugged her, overcome with gratitude. She'd been dreading telling Declan she couldn't find anyone willing to witness their marriage, had been preparing herself for the shame of it. I would be honored, she said. They walked to the church together, Mrs. Morrison keeping up a steady stream of cheerful chatter that helped calm Ruby's nerves. The church was empty when they arrived, just Reverend Michaels waiting at the altar, and Declan standing near the front pew. Declan turned when he heard the door open, and his face transformed when he saw Ruby. He crossed to meet her halfway down the aisle, taking her hands in his. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Ruby managed, though her voice was shaky. A commotion at the door made them all turn. A ranch hand Ruby recognized as one of Declan's neighbors hurried in, stamping snow from his boots. "Sorry I'm late, boss," he said to Declan. "Had to finish morning chores. I'm here to stand witness like you asked." "Thank you, Jim," Declan said, relief evident in his voice. They had their witnesses. They had their reverend. They had each other. "Shall we begin?" Reverend Michaels asked, moving to stand before the altar. They were halfway through the opening prayer when the church doors burst open with a bang that echoed through the small space. Martha Henderson stood in the doorway, flanked by Mayor Hutchins and Mr. Otsegborn Brennan, with at least a dozen other townsfolk crowding behind them. Her face was mottled with rage. "Stop this at once!" she demanded, striding down the aisle like an avenging angel. "This wedding cannot proceed." Reverend Michaels paused, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Henderson, this is a house of God. You can't just burst in." "I absolutely can when a travesty is being committed." Martha's voice rang off the walls. "This woman is under council order. She has no right to marry without approval." "She has every right," Declan said coldly, stepping forward to place himself between Martha and Ruby. "There is no law that says the council can prevent two adults from marrying. There are laws of decency and propriety," Mr. Brennan interjected, pushing to the front of the crowd. "Mr. Hart, we need to speak frankly. If you go through with this marriage, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Declan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The banker pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I hold the note on your ranch. The mortgage is due for renewal in 3 months. If you marry this woman against the council's wishes, I cannot guarantee that renewal will be approved." Ruby felt the blood drain from her face. "You'd take his ranch? Because he married me." "We're trying to protect him," Mrs. Hutchins said, her voice pleading. "Mr. Hart, you're a good man with excellent prospects. Why would you ruin yourself over this woman?" "This woman," Declan said, each word sharp as a blade, "is worth more than all of you put together. She's worth more than my ranch, more than any property or position or place in your so-called respectable society. And I'll tell you something else. If the price of being part of this community is abandoning someone I love, then I want no part of it." "You don't love her," Martha scoffed. "You've known her for weeks. This isn't love, it's foolish rebellion." "Don't you dare tell me what I feel," Declan shot back. "I've loved and lost before. I know what love is, and I'm telling you, in front of God and all these witnesses, that I love Ruby Lawson. I want to marry her, to build a life with her, to grow old with her, and there is nothing you can say or do that will change my mind." Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, his face grave. "Mr. Hart, please listen to reason. The council has significant influence in this territory. We can make your life very difficult. Your business dealings, your land claims, your standing in the community, all of it can be affected by the decisions we make." "Then make my life difficult," Declan said, his voice steady despite the threat hanging in the air. "Go ahead. Take my mortgage renewal. Spread your influence. Use whatever power you think you have. But know this, I've survived things you can't imagine. I've buried a wife and child. I've crossed an ocean with nothing but hope in my pocket. I've built a life from dirt and sweat and determination, and I'm not about to let a bunch of self-righteous gossips dictate who I can love." The silence that followed was absolute. Ruby could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them, could sense the town holding its breath. Then Martha laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "How romantic. How very noble. But Mr. Hart, nobility doesn't pay debts. Nobility doesn't keep cattle fed through winter. And when you lose everything because of this foolish decision, don't say we didn't warn you." "I won't lose everything," Declan said, and he turned to look at Ruby, his eyes warm despite the cold fury directed at them. "I'll have her, and that's worth more than all the banks and councils and judgments in the world." Ruby felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked tight since Thomas died. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Declan, rather than behind him, facing the crowd with her head high. "You want to know what's really happening here?" she said, her voice carrying through the church. "You want to know what this is really about? It's not about morality or propriety or protecting anyone. It's about control. It's about punishing me for daring to be happy, for daring to take up space, for daring to believe I deserve love despite not fitting into your narrow idea of what a woman should be." "Ruby," Reverend Michaels started, but she held up a hand. "No, let me finish. For 3 years, I've made myself small for this town. I've apologized for existing. I've accepted your whispers and your cruelty and your judgment because I thought that was the price of belonging. But you know what? I don't want to belong anymore. Not if belonging means denying myself happiness, not if it means letting you dictate my worth. This is exactly the kind of prideful defiance that concerns us," Mr. Brennan said coldly. "A woman who refuses correction, who flouts community standards that only apply to people you don't like," Mrs. Morrison interrupted, her voice cutting across the bankers. Everyone turned to stare at the older woman, who'd been silent until now. "I've lived in Red Willow for 30 years, and I've watched those standards bend and twist depending on who was being judged. When Emma Brennan was caught alone with the land office clerk last summer, there was no talk of exile. When Sarah Colton went riding unchaperoned with that surveyor, no one threatened her livelihood. But Ruby who's done nothing but survive and work hard and hurt no one, she gets hauled before the council for the crime of being courted." "That's different," Martha sputtered. "Those girls are young, still learning." "Ruby is a grown woman who buried her husband and rebuilt her life," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "She deserves respect, not persecution. And if you can't see that, then the moral failure here is yours, not hers." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ruby saw some faces nodding, others frowning in disapproval. The town was splitting before her eyes, lines being drawn, allegiances being tested. "This is getting us nowhere," Mayor Hutchins said, raising his voice to be heard over the growing chatter. "Reverend Michaels, as mayor and head of the council, I'm ordering you not to perform this ceremony." Reverend Michaels looked stricken. "Mayor, I don't think you have the authority." "I have the authority granted to me by the town charter," the mayor said, "and I'm using it. This wedding will not proceed." "Actually," said a new voice from the back of the church, "it will." Everyone turned. A tall man in a wool coat and traveling clothes stood in the doorway, brushing snow from his shoulders. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and the confident bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Who are you?" Martha demanded. "Judge Morrison Whitfield, Territorial Circuit Court." The man walked down the aisle, pulling papers from his coat. "I happened to be passing through Red Willow on my way to Helena when I heard about this situation. Mrs. Morrison here is my mother, and she sent word about the council's behavior." Mrs. Morrison smiled serenely. "I may have mentioned the situation when I wrote to you last week, dear." Judge Whitfield reached the front of the church and turned to face the crowd. "I've reviewed the relevant law, and I'm here to inform you that no town council in Montana Territory has the authority to prevent a lawful marriage between consenting adults. Furthermore, threatening economic reprisals against someone for exercising their legal rights constitutes a form of coercion that could result in charges being filed." Mr. Brennan paled. "Now, see here, we weren't actually threatening. You explicitly stated you would deny Mr. Hart's mortgage renewal if he married Mrs. Lawson," the judge said mildly, "in front of witnesses. That's a threat, Mr. Brennan, and it's potentially actionable." The banker opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. "As for you, Mayor Hutchins," the judge continued, "ordering a minister not to perform a legal ceremony exceeds your authority. The church is not subject to town council jurisdiction in matters of sacrament." "But the moral standards of the community," Martha began, "are not codified law," Judge Whitfield interrupted, "and cannot be enforced as such. If you have personal objections to this marriage, you're free to hold them, but you cannot use official channels to prevent it from occurring." Ruby felt dizzy with relief and disbelief. Mrs. Morrison's son was a judge. a territorial judge who could override the council's authority. It seemed too good to be true. "Now then," Judge Whitfield said, turning to Reverend Michaels with a smile, "I believe you were in the middle of a wedding ceremony?" The Reverend looked between the judge and the council members, visibly torn. Then his shoulders straightened and he nodded. "Yes, yes, I was." "Then please, continue. I'll stay to ensure there are no further interruptions." Martha's face went from red to purple. "This is an outrage. You can't just come in here and override the will of the community." "I'm not overriding anything," the judge said calmly. "I'm simply ensuring that the law is followed. Which, I might add, is my job." He gestured to the crowd. "Anyone who wishes to stay and witness this wedding is welcome. Anyone who objects is free to leave, but there will be no more disruptions. Am I clear?" For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Martha turned and stalked toward the door, her spine rigid with fury. Mrs. Hutchins and Mrs. Brennan followed, along with about half the crowd. The others remained, some looking uncertain, others openly curious about what would happen next. Mr. Brennan stayed, though he looked like he wanted to flee. Judge Whitfield fixed him with a steady gaze. "Mr. Brennan, I trust you'll be processing Mr. Hart's mortgage renewal through the normal channels when the time comes?" Yes, of course," the banker stammered. "Excellent. I'll be checking to make sure that happens." The judge smiled, showing teeth. "Just as I'll be reviewing the council's recent decisions to ensure they've all been within proper legal bounds. Exile orders, for instance, are rather serious matters that require due process." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat. "Perhaps we were hasty. In the interest of community peace, I think we can withdraw the order against Mrs. Lawson." "How generous," Declan said dryly. Ruby squeezed his hand, silently urging him not to push further. They'd won. Against all odds, against the council's power and Martha's influence, they'd won. "Reverend?" Judge Whitfield prompted. "I believe there's a wedding to finish?" Reverend Michaels nodded, relief evident on his face. Yes, of course." He cleared his throat and looked at Ruby and Declan. "Shall we begin again from where we were interrupted?" They took their places before the altar, hands joined, while the remaining witnesses settled into the pews. Jim, Declan's ranch hand, stood on one side. Mrs. Morrison, looking extremely pleased with herself, stood on the other. Judge Whitfield remained near the back, a silent guardian against further interference. Ruby's heart hammered as Reverend Michaels opened his prayer book. This was it. This was really happening. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice stronger now, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Ruby like a benediction. She'd heard them before, at her wedding to Thomas, but they felt different now, weighted with different meaning, different hope. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Reverend Michaels continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Ruby glanced at Declan and found him already looking at her, his eyes warm and steady. He smiled, just slightly, and Ruby felt her own lips curve in response. Into this holy union, Declan Hart and Ruby Lawson now come to be joined. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Ruby held her breath, half expecting another interruption, but silence filled the church. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "Declan Hart," Reverend Michaels said, turning to him, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have, and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Declan said clearly, his voice carrying through the church. "And do you, Ruby Lawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Ruby's voice came out stronger than she expected. "I do." "The rings, please." Declan produced his mother's ring, the one Ruby had been wearing since Thursday. He slipped it off her finger, then placed it back on with careful deliberation as he repeated after the Reverend, With this ring I thee wed. All that I am I give to you, and all that I have I share with you." Ruby had no ring for Declan. They'd moved too fast for that. But when she looked at him helplessly, he just smiled and squeezed her hand. "I don't need a ring to know I'm yours," he whispered. Reverend Michaels smiled gently. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Declan, you may kiss your bride." Declan cupped Ruby's face in his hands, his touch gentle and reverent, and kissed her. It was different from their first kiss in the cabin. This one was a promise, a claim, a declaration before God and witnesses that she was his and he was hers. When they parted, Ruby was crying and smiling at the same time, and Declan's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Michaels announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Declan Hart." The small remaining crowd applauded. Mrs. Morrison dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jim let out a whoop. Even Judge Whitfield clapped, looking satisfied with the morning's work. They signed the marriage register, Ruby's hand shaking as she wrote her new name for the first time, and then they were walking back down the aisle, husband and wife, facing a future they'd build together. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and thick, covering the town in fresh white. Ruby stood on the church steps, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger and the warmth of Declan's hand in hers. "Mrs. Hart," Declan said, testing the name. "Mr. Hart," Ruby replied, and laughed at the strangeness and rightness of it. "Mrs. Tess." Morrison emerged from the church, her son close behind. "I've arranged a small celebration at my house," she announced. "Nothing fancy, just some food and drink. You'll come, won't you?" Ruby looked at Declan, who nodded. "We'd be honored." As they walked through the snowy streets to Mrs. Morrison's house, Ruby noticed curtains twitching in windows, faces peering out. The whole town would know by nightfall. They'd probably known before the ceremony even finished. News traveled fast in Red Willow. Let them know, Ruby thought. Let them see that she hadn't been broken, hadn't been driven out, hadn't surrendered to their judgment. She'd married a good man who loved her, and she'd done it on her own terms. Mrs. Morrison's celebration was indeed small, just the wedding party plus a few ranch families who'd heard about the ceremony and wanted to offer their congratulations. But it was warm and genuine, full of laughter and good wishes that felt sincere rather than obligatory. Judge Whitfield pulled Ruby aside at one point, his expression serious. "Mrs. Hart, I want you to know that I'll be staying in Red Willow for a few days to ensure the council doesn't attempt any retaliation. And I'll be writing a formal letter to the territorial governor about their attempt to exceed their authority." "Thank you," Ruby said, overwhelmed by his support. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me. You just need to be happy." The judge smiled. "My mother speaks very highly of you. She says you make the best bread in Montana territory. That's good enough for me." Later, as the celebration was winding down, Declan pulled Ruby aside. "We should talk about tonight," he said quietly. Ruby's heart skipped. She hadn't let herself think too much about their wedding night, had been too focused on just getting through the ceremony. "I thought I'd stay at the ranch," Declan continued. "Give you time to prepare, to move your things if you want. We can figure out the living arrangements over the next few days." Ruby felt a rush of affection for him, for his consideration, his respect, his unwillingness to push. "Or," she said slowly, "you could come home with me, to the cabin. It's our wedding night, Declan. We should spend it together." Something flickered in Declan's eyes, hope and desire and tenderness all at once. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Ruby took his hand. "I don't need time to prepare. I just need you." They left Mrs. Morrison's house as the winter afternoon was fading into evening. The walk back to Ruby's cabin felt both eternal and far too short. Ruby was intensely aware of Declan beside her, of the ring on her finger, of the fact that this man was now her husband. Inside the cabin, Declan built up the fire while Ruby lit lamps. The domestic routine felt both familiar and strange. They'd done these same tasks dozens of times during his visits, but everything was different now. "I should have brought some of my things," Declan said, looking around as if seeing the cabin with new eyes. "Clothes, at least." "We'll figure it out tomorrow," Ruby said. "Tonight we don't have to figure anything out." She moved to stand in front of him, reaching up to touch his face. He'd shaved that morning for the wedding, and his jaw was smooth under her fingers. "Are you scared?" he asked softly. Ruby considered the question. "A little. Are you?" "Terrified," Declan admitted. "I want to be good for you, Ruby. I want to make this work." "We'll make it work together," Ruby said, echoing his words from earlier in the week. "We'll figure it out as we go." Declan kissed her then, slow and deep, and Ruby let herself sink into it, let herself feel all the things she'd been too afraid to feel for 3 years, desire and hope, and the startling vulnerability of opening yourself to another person. They moved to the small bedroom, and in the gentle glow of lamplight, Ruby let her husband undo the buttons of her wedding dress. She'd been worried about this moment, worried about what Declan would think when he saw her body fully revealed, all her soft curves and generous flesh laid bare. But when he looked at her, there was only wonder in his eyes. "You're beautiful," he said, like it was a fact as indisputable as the sky being blue. And for the first time in her life, Ruby believed it. They came together with tenderness and laughter, with awkward moments and sweet discoveries, with the gentle patience of two people learning each other's rhythms. It wasn't perfect, first times rarely were, but it was real and warm and theirs. Afterward, lying in Declan's arms with the fire crackling in the other room and snow falling soft outside the window, Ruby felt peace settle over her like a quilt. "No regrets?" Declan murmured against her hair. "Not a single one," Ruby said. "You? Just that I didn't meet you sooner." Declan tightened his arms around her. "But we have now, and that's what matters." Ruby thought about the path that had led them here, her grief, his loss, the cruel town and the Christmas auction and the $30 bid that had changed everything. It hadn't been an easy road, and she suspected harder days were still ahead. But lying there in her husband's arms, warm and safe and loved, Ruby thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way home again. They spent the weekend in a blissful cocoon, barely leaving the cabin except to fetch water and check on the animals. Declan brought over some of his clothes and basic necessities, and they began the process of merging their lives. It was in the small moments that Ruby felt her heart expanding, watching Declan shave at her mirror, finding his boots by her door, cooking breakfast for 2 instead of 1. They were building something together, something that felt solid and real. On Monday morning, Declan had to return to the ranch to tend to his cattle. He kissed Ruby goodbye at the door, promising to return by evening. "I don't like leaving you," he admitted. "I'll be fine," Ruby assured him. "I have bread to bake and orders to fill. The world doesn't stop just because we got married." But after he left, the cabin felt too quiet. Ruby threw herself into work, kneading dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary, trying not to think about what might be happening in town. Would people treat her differently now? Would the marriage change anything? She got her answer late that afternoon when someone knocked on her door. Ruby opened it to find Sarah Colton, the schoolteacher, standing on her porch with a covered dish. "Mrs. Hart," Sarah said, a little shyly, "I wanted to congratulate you on your marriage. I also wanted to apologize." Ruby blinked in surprise. "Apologize for what?" "For not speaking up sooner. For letting Martha and the others treat you so poorly without saying anything." Sarah held out the dish. "I made you a casserole. I know it's traditional to bring food to newlyweds, and I thought, well, I wanted you to know that not everyone in Red Willow supported the council's behavior." Ruby took the dish, her throat tight. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know." "I also wanted to ask," Sarah continued, fidgeting with her gloves, "if you might have time to teach me some of your baking techniques. I've tried to make bread, but it always turns out like a brick. And now that you're married to Mr. Hart, well, everyone's talking about what a wonderful cook you are." Ruby smiled. "I'd be happy to teach you. Come by Thursday afternoon if you're free." After Sarah left, Ruby stood in her doorway and watched the schoolteacher walk back down the street. More people were out than usual for a winter afternoon, and Ruby noticed several of them nodding to Sarah, clearly asking what she'd been doing at the Hart cabin. The next visitor came an hour later, Mrs. Perkins from the general store, also bearing a dish and congratulations. Then Mrs. Chen, whose husband owned the new restaurant. Then 3 of the ranch wives, together as if for moral support. By the time Declan returned that evening, Ruby's kitchen was full of covered dishes, and her heart was full of cautious hope. Word's gotten out that you're an excellent cook, one of the women had said, and that you're willing to teach. I was wondering if you might consider offering lessons? I'd pay, of course. Ruby had said yes to all of them, had scheduled lessons and orders, had felt something shift in how the town saw her. She wasn't the fat widow anymore. She was Mrs. Hart, the baker, the teacher, the woman who'd stood up to the council and won. You look happy, Declan observed, pulling her into his arms. I am happy, Ruby said, surprised to find it was true. People came by. They were kind. Not everyone, but some. And they want me to teach them to bake. Of course they do. You're the best baker in the territory. Declan kissed her forehead. I told you people would come around. Some of them, anyway, Ruby said. She knew Martha and her closest allies would never forgive her, would never accept her marriage as legitimate. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't need everyone's approval. Maybe she just needed her own. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Declan split his time between the ranch and the cabin, and Ruby began teaching baking lessons twice a week. The money was good, and more importantly, the work gave her purpose and connection to the community. Not everyone welcomed the change. Martha Henderson made sure Ruby knew she was still disapproved of, finding small ways to exclude her from church committees and social events. Mrs. Brennan was icily polite on the rare occasions they encountered each other. The mayor avoided Ruby entirely, clearly uncomfortable with how the whole situation had resolved. But others, more than Ruby had expected, were kind. They bought her bread, signed up for her lessons, invited her and Declan to dinner. Slowly, carefully, Ruby began to feel like she belonged again, but on her own terms this time. In early February, Declan came home one evening with news. I had a visitor at the ranch today, he said over supper. Mr. Chen from the restaurant. Oh. Ruby looked up from her stew. He wants to buy your bread exclusively. 3 dozen loaves a week, plus whatever pies and pastries you're willing to make. He'll pay premium prices. Declan grinned. Ruby, you could turn this into a real business. Ruby's mind raced with the possibilities. With that kind of steady income, combined with the teaching and Declan's ranch earnings, they'd be more than comfortable. They could expand, maybe hire help, maybe... We could afford to think about children, Declan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. If you want them. I know we haven't talked about it much, but I've been thinking I'd like to try again. With you. Ruby reached across the table to take his hand. She'd been thinking about it too, wondering if her body would cooperate this time, if God would grant them what he'd denied her with Thomas. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, Ruby thought about how much had changed in just 2 months. She'd gone from isolated and hopeless to married and building a business. She'd gone from being the town's object of pity to being Mrs. Hart, a woman with value and purpose. The council's threat had turned into the catalyst for her happiness. Their attempt to break her had instead rebuilt her stronger. What are you thinking about? Declan asked, his voice drowsy. How we almost didn't happen, Ruby said. If the council hadn't threatened me, if you hadn't proposed, if any number of things had gone differently, but they didn't, Declan said firmly. We happened. We're happening, and we'll keep happening, no matter what anyone says. Ruby smiled in the darkness. I love you, she said. She'd been saying it more often lately, testing the words, finding they fit better each time. I love you too, Declan replied. Now get some sleep, Mrs. Hart. We have a future to build tomorrow. Ruby closed her eyes, warm and safe in her husband's arms, and let herself dream of that future, of bread rising and children laughing and a table full of family, of a life lived fully and unapologetically, of happiness earned through courage and love. The fat widow was gone. In her place was Ruby Hart, and she was just beginning. Spring came late to Red Willow that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world. The snow melted in rushing streams, wildflowers burst from the thawing earth, and the air filled with birdsong and the promise of new beginnings. Ruby stood in the doorway of the cabin one April morning, a hand resting on the subtle swell of her belly, and marveled at how different everything looked bathed in sunlight and hope. She was 3 months pregnant, a fact she and Declan had kept quiet for the first anxious weeks, afraid to jinx it, afraid to hope too much. But the baby had held on, growing steadily, making its presence known through waves of morning sickness that had finally begun to ease. "You should be resting," Declan said from behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "I've been resting all morning," Ruby protested. "I need to check the bread for Mr. Chen's order." "I checked it. It's perfect, as always." Declan pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're working too hard, Ruby. The business is doing well. You don't have to take every order that comes in." Ruby leaned into him, acknowledging the truth of his words. Her baking business had exploded in the past few months. What had started with Mr. Chen's restaurant had expanded to include regular orders from 3 other establishments in neighboring towns, plus her twice-weekly teaching sessions that were now booked solid through summer. She had more work than she could handle and was training 2 young women from town to help with the volume. The money was excellent. More than that, the work gave her a sense of pride and accomplishment that she'd never experienced before. People didn't just tolerate her now, they sought her out, valued her skills, paid good money for her expertise. But Declan was right. She was tired, and the baby needed her to slow down. "I'll talk to Mr. Chen about reducing my weekly order," Ruby said. "After the summer rush." "You'll talk to him today," Declan countered firmly. "Or I will." Ruby turned in his arms to face him. "You're very bossy for someone who couldn't make toast without burning it 6 months ago." "I learned from the best," Declan grinned. "And now I'm using those teaching skills to tell my stubborn wife to take care of herself." Ruby kissed him, soft and lingering, tasting coffee and affection. "Fine. I'll talk to him today, but only because you asked so nicely." "That wasn't nice, that was bossy, but I'll take the compliance however I can get it." They were still laughing when someone knocked on the door. Ruby opened it to find Mrs. Morrison standing there, looking unusually serious. "Ruby, dear, Declan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you should know." The older woman stepped inside, wringing her hands. "It's about the Christmas auction. Martha's been making noise about it at the church auxiliary meetings." Ruby's stomach clenched. "What kind of noise?" "She's proposing new rules for this year's auction. Married women wouldn't be allowed to participate. Only unmarried ladies looking for courtship opportunities." Mrs. Morrison's expression was troubled. "She's positioning it as a return to traditional values, but everyone knows it's aimed at you." Ruby sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Of course Martha wasn't done. Ruby had been foolish to think that months of relative peace meant the battle was over. Martha Henderson didn't forget slights, and she certainly didn't forgive them. "Let her make her rules," Ruby said, trying to sound unconcerned. "I'm married now. I don't need to participate in the auction." "That's not the point," Declan said, his voice tight with anger. "The point is she's still trying to control you, to punish you. She's rewriting the rules specifically to exclude you." "Actually," Mrs. Morrison said carefully, "I think it's about more than exclusion. Martha's been saying that last year's auction was a disgrace, that the rules need to be stricter to prevent unseemly behavior. She's using your courtship with Declan as an example of what happens when standards aren't enforced." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Our courtship was perfectly respectable." "We know that, dear. But Martha has a way of twisting things to support her narrative." Mrs. Morrison patted Ruby's hand. "I wanted to warn you before the next auxiliary meeting. She's going to propose these new rules formally, and I suspect she has enough support to pass them." After Mrs. Morrison left, Ruby and Declan sat in silence for a long moment. "I hate that she still has this power," Ruby said finally. "I hate that I let her get to me." "She doesn't have power unless we give it to her," Declan said. "You don't need the Christmas auction, Ruby. You don't need their approval or their traditions. You have your business, your students, your husband. You have everything that matters." Ruby knew he was right, but it still stung. The auction had been where everything changed, where Declan had publicly declared her worth. The thought of Martha corrupting that memory, turning it into ammunition for her moral crusade, made Ruby's chest ache. "I want to fight back," she said quietly. "I want to show her she can't just rewrite history to suit her prejudices." "Then we'll fight," Declan said simply. "Tell me what you need." Ruby thought about it, turning the problem over in her mind. Martha wanted to exclude married women from the auction, wanted to pretend that last year's events had been improper rather than beautiful. How could Ruby counter that narrative? An idea began to form, audacious and slightly terrifying. "What if I participated anyway?" Ruby said slowly. "What if I prepared a basket for this year's auction, even though I'm married?" Declan raised an eyebrow. Martha would have a fit. Exactly. And she'd either have to reject the basket publicly, making her look petty and vindictive, or she'd have to allow it, which would undermine her whole campaign about proper standards. "Ruby," Declan said carefully, "are you sure you want to poke this particular bear? We've had months of relative peace. The business is thriving. You're pregnant. We're happy. Is it worth stirring up trouble?" Ruby stood and walked to the window, looking out at the spring sunshine, at the town that had rejected her and then reluctantly accepted her, and now didn't quite know what to do with her. "I spent 3 years making myself small," she said. "I apologized for existing, for taking up space, for daring to grieve in a way that made people uncomfortable. And when I finally found happiness, they tried to exile me for it. We won that battle, but Martha's still fighting the war. She's still trying to control the narrative, to make it seem like what happened between us was shameful instead of beautiful." Ruby turned to face her husband. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for Martha's next attack. I want to face her head on one more time and make it clear that I'm not ashamed, that we're not ashamed, that our love story is ours to tell, not hers to distort." Declan studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll do it. But Ruby, we do it together. If you're making a basket for the auction, I'm bidding on it, and I'm bidding high enough to make a statement." Ruby felt a smile tug at her lips. "How high?" $50, Declan said firmly. "Double what I paid last year. Let the whole town see that you're worth even more to me now than you were then." $50 is a fortune," Ruby protested. "We're saving for the baby." "We're doing fine," Declan interrupted. "The ranch is profitable, your business is thriving, and we can afford to make a grand gesture. Besides, it goes to the church roof fund. It's practically charitable." Ruby laughed despite her anxiety. "You're insane." "I'm in love with you. Same thing." Declan pulled her close, careful of her growing belly. "We'll show them, Ruby. We'll show all of them that love doesn't follow Martha Henderson's rules." The months between spring and December seemed to fly by in a blur of bread dough and pregnancy symptoms and preparations for the baby. Ruby's belly grew round and prominent, impossible to hide beneath even her loosest dresses. She felt the baby kick and roll, felt Declan's wonder when he placed his hands on her stomach, and felt his child moving beneath her skin. The business continued to flourish. Ruby trained her 2 assistants well enough that they could handle most of the daily orders, leaving her free to focus on the more complex specialty items in her teaching. She cut back her hours as Declan had insisted, but she didn't stop entirely. The work fed something in her soul that rest couldn't satisfy. The town's attitude toward her continued to evolve in subtle ways. Some people remained coldly polite, others warmly friendly. Martha's faction still existed, still whispered and judged, but their power seemed diminished somehow. Judge Whitfield's intervention had left a mark, a reminder that the council's authority had limits. In November, Ruby began preparing for the Christmas auction with the same care she'd brought to last year's basket. She baked and tested recipes, seeking the perfect combination of flavors and presentation. This year, she knew exactly who would win the basket, but that didn't matter. The point wasn't the auction itself. It was the statement. 2 weeks before the auction, Martha made her move. Ruby was at the church hall for the weekly auxiliary meeting when Martha stood and addressed the group. "Ladies, as you know, the Christmas auction is our biggest fundraiser of the year. I've been reviewing the guidelines, and I believe we need to clarify some rules to ensure the event maintains its proper character." Here it comes, Ruby thought, sitting up straighter. "Specifically," Martha continued, "I'm proposing that we limit participation to unmarried women of good character. The auction has always been intended as a courtship opportunity, and allowing married women to participate confuses its purpose." "That's never been a rule before," Mrs. Morrison objected. "Married women have participated for years. My own mother made a basket for the auction the year after she married my father." "Times change," Martha said crisply. "Standards must be maintained. Surely you all remember the irregularities of last year's auction." Several women glanced at Ruby, who kept her expression neutral. "I don't recall any irregularities," Sarah Colton said mildly. "I recall a generous bid that raised significant funds for the church roof. A bid of $30 for a basket from a woman who was being courted by the bidder," Martha said, her voice dripping with implication. "It made a mockery of the entire event." Ruby had promised herself she wouldn't engage, would let others fight this battle, but the words were out before she could stop them. "My husband bid on my basket because he valued my cooking and wanted to support the church," Ruby said clearly. "I fail to see how that's a mockery." "You weren't married at the time," Martha shot back. "You were a widow being courted, which made the whole display inappropriate." "I was a widow earning an honest living through my baking skills," Ruby countered. "The same skills I use now to supply 3 restaurants and teach a dozen students. Skills that everyone in this room has benefited from at one time or another." "This isn't about your skills, Ruby. It's about propriety." "No, it's about control." Ruby stood, facing Martha across the room. "You want to rewrite the rules because you don't like how last year turned out. You don't like that someone saw value in me when you'd written me off. You don't like that I'm happy and successful despite your best efforts to make me miserable." The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. "That's quite an accusation," Martha said coldly. "It's the truth." Ruby's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "You tried to drive me out of Red Willow. You failed. Now you're trying to erase what happened, to make it seem shameful instead of what it really was, the beginning of something beautiful." "I think we should take a vote," Mrs. Morrison said quickly, before Martha could respond. "All in favor of restricting the auction to unmarried women only?" About half the hands in the room went up, including Martha's and her closest allies. "All opposed?" The other half raised their hands, including Mrs. Morrison, Sarah Colton, and several of the women Ruby had taught to bake. "It's a tie," Mrs. Morrison announced, "which means the proposal fails. We need a majority to change established tradition." Martha's face flushed with anger. "This isn't over. I'll bring it before the full church council." "You do that," Ruby said calmly. "In the meantime, I'll be preparing my basket for the auction. I hope everyone enjoys it." She walked out of the meeting with her head high, feeling the weight of stairs but refusing to let them bow her shoulders. She'd said her piece, drawn her line in the sand. Whatever happened next was out of her hands. Declan was waiting outside, leaning against their wagon. "How did it go?" "I either made everything better or much worse," Ruby said, climbing up beside him. "Martha tried to ban married women from the auction. The vote tied, so the proposal failed, but she's taking it to the church council." "Let her," Declan said, snapping the reins. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." The church council met the following week, and as expected, they sided with Martha. The new rule was passed. Married women could not participate in the Christmas auction. The decision was announced from the pulpit the next Sunday, presented as a return to traditional values and proper courtship protocols. Ruby listened to the announcement with a sinking heart. She'd lost. Martha had won, after all. But as they left church that morning, Mrs. Morrison pulled Ruby aside. "Don't give up yet, dear," she said quietly. "I have an idea, but I'll need your help and your best basket." Mrs. Morrison's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Since married women couldn't participate in the official auction, she would host a separate event the same night, a married ladies' basket social, open to any woman who wanted to prepare a basket for her husband to bid on. All proceeds would still go to the church roof fund. "It's not defiance, tuts. By Miss Shantemtan, Asancham Mrs. Morrison explained to the small group of women gathered in her parlor. "It's addition. We're not competing with the official auction. We're supplementing it, doubling the fundraising potential." "Martha will see it as rebellion," one of the younger wives said nervously. "Then let her," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "We're not breaking any rules. We're married women preparing food for our husbands and raising money for the church. What could be more wholesome?" Ruby looked around the room at the assembled women, ranch wives and shopkeepers' wives, women who'd been kind to her and women who'd only recently warmed up. They were all here, all willing to stand with her against Martha's rigid control. "I'm in," Sarah Colton said. She'd married the land office clerk over the summer, a quiet ceremony that had surprised everyone. "My husband can't cook to save his life. He'll be grateful for a decent meal." One by one, the other women agreed. By the end of the meeting, they had 12 committed participants, enough to make the event viable and visible. News of the Married Ladies Basket Social spread through Red Willow like wildfire. Opinions were divided. Some saw it as harmless fun, others as a direct challenge to the council's authority. Martha, predictably, was apoplectic. She showed up at Ruby's cabin 3 days before the auction, her face mottled with rage. "This social you're planning is a disgrace," she announced without preamble. "You're deliberately undermining the church's fundraiser." "We're adding to it," Ruby corrected, continuing to knead the dough on her counter. "Every penny raised goes to the same roof fund." "How is that undermining anything?" "You're dividing the community, making a mockery of proper traditions. I'm giving married women a chance to participate in a Christmas tradition without violating your new rules," Ruby interrupted. "We're following the letter of your law, Martha. You can't object to that without admitting this was never about propriety. It was about controlling me." Martha's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won. But mark my words, Ruby Lawson, Ruby Hart," Ruby corrected gently. "This will end badly for you. People don't forget. They don't forgive. You may have charmed some of them with your baking and your sob story, but the truth always comes out. You're still the same desperate woman who threw herself at the first man who showed her attention." Ruby set down her dough and wiped her hands on her apron. 6 months ago, those words would have cut deep, would have made her question everything. Now she felt only pity for the bitter woman in front of her. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Ruby asked quietly. "That I'm desperate, that Declan only married me out of pity. Does it make you feel better about your own life to believe that?" "How dare you, she? No, how dare you?" Ruby's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "How dare you come into my home and insult my marriage? How dare you spend years tearing me down and then act surprised when I refuse to stay down? How dare you call yourself a Christian while spreading poison about a woman who's done nothing but try to live her life with dignity?" Martha's face went from red to white. "You'll regret speaking to me this way." "I regret not speaking to you this way sooner," Ruby said. "Now please leave my home. You're not welcome here." Martha left in a storm of indignation, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Ruby stood in her kitchen, hands shaking slightly, marveling at her own courage. Declan came home that evening to find Ruby unusually quiet, staring into the fire. "What happened?" he asked, settling beside her. Ruby told him about Martha's visit, about the confrontation. "I probably made things worse," she admitted, "but I couldn't let her keep saying those things. Not about us, not about our marriage." "You didn't make things worse," Declan said firmly. "You stood up for yourself. For us. That's never wrong." He pulled her close, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "I'm proud of you, Ruby. You're the strongest person I know." Ruby leaned into his warmth, letting his words soak into her bones. "I'm scared," she admitted, "about the social, about what Martha might do, about everything." "I know, but we'll face it together. We always do." The night of the Christmas auction arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. The community hall blazed with light and warmth, packed with people eager for the year's biggest social event. The official auction started at 7, and the Married Ladies Basket Social was scheduled for 8:30, giving the unmarried ladies their spotlight first. Ruby arrived at 8 with her basket, the finest work she'd ever done. Inside was her famous fried chicken, biscuits that melted on the tongue, potato salad fragrant with herbs, gingerbread cookies decorated with royal icing, and a cherry pie that had taken 2 days to prepare. The basket itself was woven from willow and lined with fabric she'd embroidered herself, a pattern of hearts and stars that had taken weeks of evening work. She'd also made herself a new dress for the occasion, using money from her business. It was deep green wool that complemented her coloring, cut to accommodate her 6-month belly, fitted to show off her figure rather than hide it. When she'd shown Declan that morning, his eyes had gone wide. "You're stunning," he'd said, and she'd believed him. Now walking into the hall on her husband's arm, Ruby felt eyes turned toward her. She heard whispers, saw Martha's scandalized expression, noticed the mayor's wife nudging her husband and pointing. Let them look, Ruby thought. Let them see a woman who's happy and loved and not ashamed. The unmarried ladies' auction was already underway, Emma Brennan's basket fetching $20 from a young lawyer. Ruby watched with detached interest, remembering how terrifying this had been last year, how certain she'd been that no one would bid, how much had changed in 12 months. At 8:30, Mrs. Morrison took the podium and announced the Married Ladies Basket Social. A ripple of excitement ran through the crowd. This was the scandal everyone had been gossiping about, the rebellion against Martha's rules. "Now, gentlemen," Mrs. Morrison said with a smile, "this is your chance to bid on your own wife's cooking and support the church roof fund at the same time. Who knows, you might even win." Laughter swept the room, breaking some of the tension. The first basket went for $12, the husband bidding enthusiastically while his wife blushed. The second fetched $15. One by one, the baskets sold, each one representing a small act of defiance, a married woman saying she had worth beyond what Martha Henderson deemed proper. Finally, Mrs. Morrison lifted Ruby's basket. And our last basket of the evening, prepared by Ruby Hart. The room quieted. This was what everyone had been waiting for, the moment that would either vindicate Martha's concerns or prove Ruby's point. Ruby held her breath as Mrs. Morrison opened the bidding. "Shall we start at $10? $50, Declan called out immediately, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. Gasps echoed around the room. $50 was more than any basket had ever fetched in Red Willow's history, more than double what he'd bid last year. "Did he say 50? Mayor Hutchins sputtered. "I said 50, Declan confirmed, standing up. "And I'll go higher if anyone wants to challenge me." No one did. The room was utterly silent. Mrs. Morrison's smile was triumphant. "Sold to Mr. Hart for $50. And with that generous bid, gentlemen, we've raised over $200 for the church roof tonight between both auctions. Thank you all for your generosity." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then building, until the whole hall was clapping. Ruby saw some faces still tight with disapproval, Martha's chief among them, but many more were smiling, even cheering. Declan walked to the front of the hall and paid Mrs. Morrison, who accepted the bills with barely concealed glee. Then he turned to Ruby and offered his arm. "Mrs. Hart, would you do me the honor of sharing this meal with me?" Ruby took his arm, her eyes stinging with happy tears. "I would be delighted, Mr. Hart." They sat at the same table they'd occupied last year, and Ruby unpacked the basket with hands that shook only slightly. Around them, other couples were settling in to share their meals, the hall filled with laughter and conversation. $50, Ruby said, shaking her head. "Declan, that's—" "Exactly what you're worth," Declan said firmly. He took a piece of chicken, bit into it, and closed his eyes in exaggerated pleasure. "Maybe more. This is even better than last year. It's the same recipe." "Then you're worth more than $50. Declan grinned. "Good thing I married you when I did. At this rate, I couldn't afford you by next Christmas." Ruby laughed, the sound bubbling up from deep in her chest. She looked around the hall, at the people who'd judged her, and the people who'd supported her, at the community that had tried to break her and failed. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Declan agreed. "And next year, we'll do it again. Maybe with a baby on your hip." Ruby's hand went to her belly, feeling the baby kick as if in agreement. "Next year," she promised. They stayed late at the social, talking and laughing with the other couples. Even some of Martha's allies unbent enough to congratulate them on the baby, to comment on how well Ruby looked. It wasn't complete acceptance, would probably never be that, but it was progress. As they were leaving, Reverend Michaels pulled them aside. "I wanted to thank you both," he said quietly, "for what you did tonight, for showing the community that love and marriage can take many forms, that worth isn't determined by size or age or what people think you deserve." "We didn't do anything special," Ruby protested. "You did something brave," the Reverend corrected. "You stood up for yourselves when it would have been easier to back down. You reminded us that the heart of Christianity is love, not judgment. That's no small thing." Walking home through the cold December night, Ruby felt peace settle over her like snow. The battle with Martha wasn't over. It might never be truly over. But Ruby had proven her point, had shown the town that she wouldn't be shamed or silenced or driven away. She was Ruby Hart, baker, teacher, wife, soon-to-be mother. She had value, had worth, had a place in this world that was hers by right, not by permission. And if Martha Henderson couldn't accept that, well, that was Martha's problem, not Ruby's. The baby came in March, a daughter they named Sarah after Declan's first wife. Ruby had worried about whether that would feel strange, but when Declan had suggested it, tears in his eyes, she'd understood. It wasn't about replacing the past, it was about honoring it while building something new. Little Sarah was healthy and loud. With her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin, she nursed eagerly, slept fitfully, and within days had both her parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. The town celebrated the birth with the enthusiasm small towns reserve for new life. Even Martha Henderson sent a blanket, though she didn't visit in person. Ruby accepted the gift graciously, understanding it for what it was. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but a truce. That December, when the Christmas auction rolled around again, Ruby prepared another basket. She was nursing Sarah and couldn't attend in person, but Declan went and bid $50 again, starting what would become a tradition. Every year for the next 20 years, Ruby would prepare a basket and Declan would bid $50, a public declaration of love and worth that never failed to make Ruby cry happy tears. The Married Lady's Basket. Social became a permanent fixture, growing larger each year until it rivaled the original auction in both size and fundraising. Martha continued to disapprove, but her voice grew smaller as the years passed, less influential, less powerful to wound. Ruby's baking business flourished. She eventually opened a small shop on Main Street, employing 6 women and supplying restaurants throughout the territory. She taught dozens of students over the years, passing on her grandmother's secrets and her own hard-won wisdom. She and Declan had 3 more children, 2 boys and another girl, filling the cabin and the ranch house with noise and laughter and life. The properties they'd saved became a legacy to pass down, proof that love and hard work could build something lasting. On Ruby's 50th birthday, Declan threw her a party at the community hall. Half the town came, bringing gifts and well wishes, sharing stories of how Ruby had taught them to bake or helped them through hard times or simply shown them that strength came in many forms. Martha Henderson was there too, older now and softer, her power long since diminished. She approached Ruby near the end of the evening, when most guests had gone home. "I owe you an apology," Martha said stiffly, "for how I treated you all those years ago. It was unkind and unchristian, and I'm sorry." Ruby studied the older woman, seeing genuine remorse beneath the proud exterior. "Thank you for saying that. I forgive you." "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," Martha admitted. "I spent so many years being cruel because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of women like you. Women who didn't need permission to be happy, who didn't follow the rules I thought kept the world ordered. You terrified me because you showed me that my way wasn't the only way." Martha smiled sadly. "You were braver than I ever was." Ruby reached out and squeezed Martha's hand. "It's never too late to be brave." After Martha left, Ruby stood in the hall where her life had changed so dramatically, where Declan had bid $30 on a basket everyone else had rejected. She thought about that woman she'd been, broken and scared and certain she deserved nothing. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and successful and surrounded by love. The journey between those 2 versions of herself had been hard, filled with judgment and pain and moments when she'd wanted to give up. But she hadn't given up. She'd fought, had stood her ground, had refused to let anyone else define her worth. And in the end, she'd won. Not because Martha had apologized, or because the town had accepted her, or because her business had succeeded. She'd won because she'd learned to see her own value, to believe in her own worth, to know that she deserved love and happiness and a full, beautiful life. Declan found her there, standing alone in the empty hall, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," Ruby said. "How much has changed. Any regrets?" Ruby turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd seen her worth when no one else had, who'd fought for her, who'd loved her through everything. "Not a single one," she said, and kissed him. They walked home through the December snow, hand in hand, toward a house full of children and warmth and all the messy, beautiful chaos of a life well lived. Behind them, the community hall stood quiet and dark, holding memories of baskets and bids, and a love story that had started with $30 and transformed into something priceless. Ruby Hart had been the fat widow once, the woman everyone mocked and pitied, but she'd become so much more. A wife, a mother, a businesswoman, a teacher, a friend. She'd become someone who knew her own worth and never let anyone take it from her again. And as she stepped into her warm, noisy, perfect home, Ruby smiled and thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd been worth everything all along. She just needed someone to bid on her basket to help her see it. The end had been there all along, waiting in a simple truth. She was priceless, and this time she'd never forget it.